Hi all, thanks for joining. I'm Connor Spelsey and I organized this event with the help of some of the folks speaking today and many others. I'm a former lawyer, I'm the co-founder of the Blockchain Association, and I'm the founder of the DAO Research Cooperative. So this isn't news probably to anyone who's on this call, but DAOs are cutting edge organizational structures and they're very limited precedent to help DAO stakeholders understand how to operate DAOs. DAO stakeholders are starting to think through best practices for legal, for governance, for treasury management, other critical issues that I'm sure many of you are thinking through right now with your communities. But much of that foundational learning and research is really captured and siloed within those communities. So we started this summit to encourage people in the DAO community to collaborate and to help identify the most pressing issues for DAOs and strategies for resolving those issues. Our goal is for today's sessions to have clear outputs that can act as foundational building blocks for the community as we start to develop precedents that make it easier for you and for the next generation to operate DAOs. I'm also doing this work through the DAO Research Cooperative, which is an organization currently funded by Compound, UNISWAP, and AAVE grants. It leverages pooled DAO resources to purchase and open source necessary information necessary to the operation of DAOs. Now at the DAO Research Cooperative, we're gonna host more events like this, and we're gonna encourage more participation and cooperation between DAOs. So if you're interested at all in getting involved, just reach out to me on Twitter at C_Spelsey. Now, just sort of a housekeeping item, none of the information provided by speakers today is legal or investment advice, unsurprisingly. And with that, I'm honored to hand it over to Dan Boneh, a pioneer in crypto and a co-director of Stanford Center for Blockchain Research. And then we'll get to your illustrious MC, David Hoffman, co-founder of Bankless.
Awesome.
With that,
Thank you, Connor. Yeah, welcome everyone to this virtual DAO Summit. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to see this event take place. Let me just introduce myself briefly, and then we'll get to the topics of the day. So let's see. So I'm a professor at Stanford. I love blockchain technology. I've been in this space since 2014, and I absolutely love the technology that is driving blockchains and enabling DAOs and so on. Because of that, we set up the Center for Blockchain Research, the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research, which includes about 8 faculty doing research in the area, in different areas of blockchains. I particularly focus on technology for blockchains, particularly cryptography, consensus, and things like that. I should say that the Center for Blockchain Research, CBR as we call it, offers many courses on blockchains. If you're interested in taking any of our courses, they're available online. Just go to check out cbr.stanford.edu. You'll see a list of the courses, and anyone is welcome to sign up. In particular, I would recommend our CS251 course, which is sort of an introduction to blockchains. Takes students all the way from zero to writing smart contracts and launching DeFi projects, as well as potentially launching new blockchains. So why are we here today? Well, the goal is to sort of bring together a bunch of DAO communities to discuss common issues. And I'm really looking forward to the talks, to the upcoming talks. We have a wonderful collection of speakers coming, so this should really be a fun event. But I guess before we do that, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction, just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page. So first of all, let's start at the beginning. So like, what is a DAO? Well, you know, a DAO technically is just a smart contract that basically interacts with the public, right? So it takes proposals, people vote on the proposals, and then those proposals get deployed. That's at a technical level what a DAO is. But really, it's much more than that, right? In reality, a DAO is kind of a way for a group of individuals to pool their resources together. Or as we like to say, a DAO is sort of an internet native business that's managed by its members by means of a governance. Yeah, and the question is, of course, how to run governance correctly, and those are one of the things we'll talk about today. What's interesting is that the root of trust for a DAO is really just the public source code for the DAO smart contract, right? So anyone can inspect the source code for the DAO, gain confidence that the DAO really does what it's supposed to be doing or what it's claimed to be doing, then become a member and start contributing to the DAO community. Yeah, so that's basically kind of what we're discussing today. And there are many examples of DAOs. Maybe I'll just mention 2 or 3 of them, again, just to make sure we're on the same page. So I guess there's a Moloch DAO, which is kind of a well-known one. This is a DAO that's used for funding Ethereum development. So people who want to get funded for particular things, for developing particular aspects of Ethereum can write proposals post them, the DAO members vote on which proposals to fund, and then the first sent to developers. Yeah, so it's kind of a really cool way in which code can influence what gets implemented in the Ethereum ecosystem. There's a one that's actually a really fun one that's formed recently. Probably many of you have heard of it. Is the Pleasure DAO, Pleaser DAO, which is a DAO that's meant to collect art. And in fact, recently it bought a piece of art that was created by the Tor Foundation. This was a wonderful way to fund the Tor Foundation. So this is an example of a DAO that's actually having a very positive, societal impact. Aragon is a way to create DAOs. So these days it's not even that difficult to create DAOs. You don't have to write the code yourself. There are systems already in place to do this for you. And there are many others that one can mention. I guess what I wanted to do before we move on to our first speaker, I just wanted to kind of list through some of the challenges that the DAO community is facing, and those are the sort of things that we'll be discussing at our event today. Yeah, so I think one of the main issues facing DAOs is basically how to properly run governance. Yeah, so basically, how do we weight the different votes? Are they weighted by the amount of funds contributed? Are they weighted by just by the individuals behind them? How do we encourage participation, right? This is, you'll see in many DAOs, they run a lot of votes, but then participation is not as high as one would like. So how do we encourage participation? And then finally, of course, in the area of governance, like what happens if the members decide to accept a particular proposal, but it turns out to be a bad idea? How do we recover from bad decisions? So I hope these things will be discussed in the meeting today, but there are many other issues that affect DAOs. So for example, in recent weeks, we've seen a couple of smart contracts that have had significant bugs in them, and that caused, serious problems. So one issue is, how do we deal with bugs in the DAO contract itself and the DAO code itself? What do we do about that? What do we do about privacy for the members, right? Not everybody wants to be known as a member of a DAO. Not everybody wants their votes to be recorded publicly. So how do we provide privacy for members? This is a pretty interesting question that's very closely related to the things I work on. What do we do about transaction costs, right? Scaling and transaction costs are always an issue in blockchains. So can we actually do something about, perhaps introducing layer 2, perhaps introducing other blockchains, perhaps changing the way transactions are priced and so on. And there's active work in all these areas. I guess other things that come to mind is one of the topics that Connor mentioned is managing the DAO Treasury. Again, these are topics that will be discussed today. What are good ways to do that? And then I'll just mention things like regulation compliance. How do we make sure that DAOs, abide by U.S. sanction rules and so on. And similarly, how do we do accounting, taxation of profits, and things like that for DAOs? So there are lots of really interesting questions around DAOs. These are kind of new, as Connor said, these are kind of new organizational structures that new and interesting problems, and that's exactly what we're going to discuss today. Okay, so I think I'll stop here. I'll just say that the Center for Blockchain Research is sort of a resource for the community. So if anyone in the audience has interesting research questions for us that you'd like our help with, feel free to reach out to me, and we'd love to help. We're basically set up as a resource to help the blockchain community. And I'll stop here. And with that, I'll hand it over to David. So all yours. David, you're muted.
Third time's a charm. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here at the virtual DAO Summit. I'm excited to introduce our first guest, and I think this is absolutely the right place to start, because at the start of this event, we need to take a broad level view. And so we are bringing on Joel Monegro and Mario Laul. Joel is a partner at Placeholder VC, a venture capital firm that invests in decentralized information networks and Web3 infrastructure. He is focused on blockchain-based solutions that help reshape capitalism by creating and distributing digital capital over the internet. He's joined by his coworker, Mario Laul, who is a researcher over at Placeholder VC and focuses on blockchain-based financial and governance innovations, and more broadly, the interplay between technological change and societal development. And we are here in this particular survey of the DAO landscape to really discuss the current state of DAO operations, DAO governance, and overall the DAO ecosystem. This is one of the realms of Ethereum, the realms of crypto that is really changing almost, it seems, every single week. And so Joel and Mario have their fingers on the pulse, and I'm excited to bring them up onto the stage to talk about the current state of DAOs. So Joel and Mario, if you could come join me on stage here. Joel, great to see you.
Hi, David.
Mario.
Same. And thank you for the intro.
Yeah, of course. All right, guys, I'm going to just let you guys have at it. So tell us about the current state of DAOs.
We will, and we actually prepared a couple of slides so that you're not just looking at our faces while we do that. Let me know if you can see the slides.
We are up and running.
Great. So we're gonna split this brief survey into two parts. I'm gonna start with just some high-level concepts very quickly to level set on how we think of DAOs, and take a quick overview into the current state of the infrastructure and development of, let's say, the concept of a DAO. And then Mario will take over with some more specific ideas and thesis about how we think about DAOs and how we think we should think about DAOs. And we're going to try and get it done in 15 minutes. I realize we may have some buffer afterwards if there are any questions that come up. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity. We're always happy to talk about these things. As David said, we both work at Placeholder, which is a venture capital firm that invests around the Web3 ecosystem. And a lot of the time, that means that we invest in DAOs. Sometimes we invest in DAOs directly through a smart contract. Sometimes we invest in companies that go on and create DAOs. Sometimes we buy into DAOs that have already existed, and sometimes we have an opportunity to work with core development teams in designing their governance systems and designing their DAOs. And so we have the privilege of looking at these problems or these questions from a variety of angles. And I would like to start with how we think about DAOs in the most general sense, and I'd say that we think of them as part of the shift, the overall trend in humanity to move from paper systems to digital systems. We're investors in Aragon, for example, in our Aragon thesis blog. We talk a little bit about the DAO thesis, and this is from a piece from last year. And we focus on what happens when you replace paper contracts with smart contracts, with digital contracts. The main observation is that DAOs are really just organizations in the most basic sense, with the key difference being that the organizations that we're used to operating in today are paper organizations, and that they're actually set up and constituted by legal contracts written in words and executed by lawyers. And it turns out that most societal structures are just these networks of contracts. A company is just a stack of different contracts, all the way from the original organizational contracts down to the employee contracts and the lease and so on and so forth. All of those are paper contracts, and societies themselves or nation states are ultimately organized also by these paper contracts. But now with blockchains, we have a new tool, which are smart contracts. These digital contracts that allow us to create agreements written in code instead of words. And so it's kind of natural to then expect that organizations themselves would then turn out to be created via digital contracts, and that's exactly what DAOs are. And we're very excited about what this means overall over the long term, because overall we see it as a technology that lowers the cost of creating organizations. And more importantly, it opens a new kind, or it opens the design space to new kinds of organizations that maybe would have been difficult to create with the kind of paper contract system. And that's this part of this quote here that talks about, well, what about those systems that would be too expensive or too complex to create with paper contracts? Things that, for example, something that's larger than a Facebook group but smaller than a company. But then also things that may be much larger than a company, what you might call a mega organization, where you might be able to have thousands or tens of thousands or potentially even millions of stakeholders all distributed across the world that is very, very hard to do with paper contracts. So trying to pull us back to the present a little bit, we pulled this from a Nielsen report that's looking at the DAO infrastructure stack, and this is kind of a quick view into what from a kind of technical standpoint, the infrastructure for DAOs looks like. And this report kind of segments it into these categories. There are frameworks that allow you to create DAOs, and this is what we were talking about in the very beginning of the session. That is now easier to create a DAO as these frameworks emerge and reduce the amount of code that is required to create them. And then on top of that, we're starting to see more tools emerge to tackle different aspects of DAO management, so to speak. So in a typical organization, you have different departments, right? You have the base layer contracts, and then on top you have accounting, and you have legal, and you have HR, and you have treasury, and you have all of these functions. So we're starting to see different components or different tools or protocols emerge to tackle that different functionality. So here, the layer of controllers, we're seeing tools that deal with voting. In the layer of treasury, we're starting to see tools emerge that help DAOs manage their funds. A lot of DAOs come down to fund management in many cases. We see protocols that deal with the human capital in DAOs and what humans do, and we see everything from code collaboration to work management and how whatever the DAOs do for work. And then we see aggregators as well that are emerging, which are platforms and user interfaces that aggregate activity across all of the DAOs or across a number of DAOs that make it easier for people to participate in many DAOs at once. And it's a very young and emerging ecosystem, and it's worth saying that it includes Web2 tools. While the companies and protocols that show up in the stack are mostly Web3 focused, a lot of DAO activity happens on places like GitHub, Discourse, chat rooms like Telegram or Discord, and a lot of the conversation happens on Twitter. So it's this very interesting mix between Web3 tools and Web2 platforms. I'm not going to go through this whole list. This is another look at the DAO ecosystem from a different perspective. We can share this presentation afterwards if you want to click through or just search it by this link below, and really encourage you to go explore, if you haven't already, all the different DAOs that are emerging. This isn't really focused on infrastructure. This is all the different kinds of DAOs that are coming up. And we see that they're in very different categories, and it's a very diverse ecosystem. We see DAOs that deal with protocols, DAOs that deal with, yep. Oh. Oh, let me see. Let me restart it. Can you see it? Okay, so you're actually behind. Do you see all the different DAOs?
Yes, we are looking at a page that says DAO infrastructure stack. Now we see you starting to share your screen again. There we go.
So now at a page that just, great, awesome. So this should be the one that starts with DAO operating systems and then protocol DAOs and investment DAOs and so on.
Yes, looks like it's working now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, here the point is that DAOs aren't confined to a single type of DAO in terms of what they do. As Dan was explaining in the beginning of the conversation, we have DAOs that work in media. We have DAOs that are social networks, really. We have DAOs that focus on doing grants, those that collect art and so on. And I think it's really a testament to how broad the concept of a DAO is if you think of it as a digital organization. Just as we have many different kinds of organizations in society today, from companies to religions to nation states, all of those can be, or all of those categories can show up in the DAO ecosystem, and potentially will uncover new categories as a result of the lower costs to create DAOs. This is a quick view into just some top line metrics of the current state. This is from a screenshot from a page called Deep DAO, where we can see the DAOs by AUM. AUM in this context, it means the value that they're holding in the DAO's treasury as digital assets. And we can see that we're getting to a point where these numbers are important. The Rarible DAO sees an AUM of about $130 million. API 3 has about $100 million in treasury, and so on. And these figures have been growing over time. They tend to be somewhat tethered to the market, in the sense that a lot of them hold in their treasury either their own tokens, which have volatile market prices, or assets like Ethereum or BTC, or representations of BTC that are quite volatile. And so we've seen DAOs basically go from $20 million in AUM all the way to 300 million, and then all the way back to 50. So these are volatile numbers, but in general, I think it's a testament to when they work, they can work quite well. At the end of the day, we have DAOs that manage assets that are greater than many companies. We can also take a look on Deep DAO at the top DAOs by members, and it would be this column here, where we can see how many people make up, or at least entities make up the membership of a DAO. And we can see some pretty significant numbers here. Sushi and Balancer, which are the top two. Sushi counts 52,000 members, or over 52,000, and Balancer counts over 35,000. And I can't really think of a company in the world having, maybe there's a couple, but having over 50,000 stakeholders. I know that there are some large unions and organizations that do have that kind of membership, but it's pretty rare, and critically, it's pretty expensive to maintain. And I think the main point here is that you can really have organizations that scale really well as a result of smart contracts, in the sense that they can scale to tens of thousands of members, and I think eventually millions of members. Whereas while the cost to manage all of those stakeholders doesn't necessarily scale or grow as much. We can also look at top DAOs by number of proposals. This would be kind of nuanced, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But a lot of what a DAO does at the end of the day is really coordinate human decisions, and a lot of that happens through proposals. And also we can see how many people vote into those proposals. So I would encourage you to go to Deep DAO if you haven't already, and explore those numbers. This is from a report by Lee, and that is recent, that counts the composition of DAO treasuries in DeFi. And this speaks to the different assets that are held in the treasuries. And that's also an interesting aspect of it. DAOs by and large manage digital assets, and they can be quite diverse in what they hold. And finally, you can also take a look on Deep DAO at the concentration, or token concentration, among DAO participants. And you can see the AUM held by the top participants in DAOs, and that yields some interesting data. But really, going to Deep DAO and playing with the numbers yourselves is an interesting exercise. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Mario to talk about some more thesis-driven stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Joel. Yeah, I'll add a little bit of broader context and say a few things about a major theme in the DAO space, which is governance, while also committing the cardinal sin of having a bit too much text on my slides, but there it is. So the way we see it, blockchains and DAOs are first and foremost a process or institutional innovation. And this innovation is centered around four things. First, improved access to digital services in a way that is more tamper and censorship resistant than traditionally. This is related to cryptography and decentralization. Second, programmability, which is related to for software development and software-based automation. Composability, which is related to the idea of interoperability, which in the blockchain space, as many of you know, is still largely network specific, but eventually I'm sure we will have inter-network composability. And finally, governance, which is most closely related to the concept of DAOs. So I define governance quite abstractly as a process of applying any design feature or control mechanism to maintain or steer a system. The reason why I'm defining it in this abstract way is to make sure that it includes some things that I think when people talk about DAO governance are occasionally underappreciated as forms of governance. For example, this includes establishing some control mechanism within the system in a relatively permanent way, for example, through software protocols, which is actually a form of institutionalization, as well as mechanisms that don't require active participation or involvement by humans to achieve some task, which is another way of saying automation as itself a form of governance. So besides software-based automation, what are some other examples of governance mechanisms in DAOs? There's the core software and organizational development process, which includes producing the official documentation, doing communications with the outside world. This together with the pre-launch decision-making process, especially around things like resource allocation, is usually, at least initially, spearheaded by the founders of the DAO or the core team, who provide the initial leadership and ideas that others can then gradually adopt and reproduce. And depending on the organization, there's a more or less formalized process around submitting and handling governance proposals. If there's a token, and often in the context of DAOs, there is a token, token holders have the ability to vote on these proposals. And often there's also a requirement for a digital signature by a smaller group of people before the proposal can be executed. And finally, there may also be technical councils or other ad hoc governing bodies participating in DAO, which again may be elected by token holders or occasionally appointed by the core team. Some challenges in DAO governance. I think we're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to go through them fast. I was lucky enough for the previous speaker to actually touch on some of these. But by and large, I would say that apart from some unique ones related to cybersecurity and running a decentralized organization and governing it in a distributed way, a lot of the challenges that DAOs are facing are actually very similar to what traditional organizations are struggling with, starting from the need to balance the interests between different stakeholders, both inside and outside the organization, how to divide tasks, how to structure the organization, to what degree should the organization be using delegation to achieve its goals, and if it does use delegation, how does it address the principal agent issues that arise from that, managing change, resolving conflicts, keeping the community engaged, especially in the context of DAOs where the participants, the token holders, are expected to actively contribute and also participate in the governance procedures. So that's an important challenge. And of course, like any other organization, unless a DAO is somehow capable of soliciting voluntary contributions on a long-term basis, a DAO needs to have some kind of an economic or revenue model around the use case or the primary service that they're providing to society. And finally, a few very quick things, unless David wants to cut me short, on some recent trends in DAO governance. First, especially in larger and more established DAOs, there's been a trend towards a more strict division of labor and specialization. DAOs are organizing themselves into domain teams, core units, or describing themselves as DAOs of DAOs. I already mentioned grants, allocation, and treasury management in general has become a core focus of collective decision-making in many DAOs. Delegation, again, bringing the principal agent issue, which naturally leads to growing recognition of the needs for checks and balances and accountability in different roles. And finally, one thing that I'm observing is that DAOs are increasingly exhibiting what sociologists call, in other contexts, institutional isomorphism, which is a term that basically refers to growing similarities between different independent organizations. And what drives these similarities in the case of DAOs is, first of all, imitation. if an organization is faced with a problem or a task and it's uncertain about how to achieve this, the goal, it might look at other organizations and just imitate what others are doing. Standardization, for example, things like Gnosis multi-sig wallet or the Compounds governance contract, and other forms of standards that are emerging in the space. And finally, as the space professionalizes, which is increasingly the case with things like treasury operations and financial analysis and other roles in the DAOs, that also drives similarities in the space. I will end with that. I hope the very short overview helps set the stage for the rest of the event. And if you would like to learn more about how we've been thinking about these and other topics at placeholder, you can visit the website on the slide or follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Mario, Joel, thank you so much for that presentation. That was absolutely fantastic. And I see a lot of what you guys were talking about in that presentation with my experiences with DAOs as well. So as we move forward, we are going to move into our next topic of conversation, which is our first working session, which is key DAO functions and how they can and are being hampered by legal complexity. And so we have the moderator of this whole entire event, Connor Spelcy, to introduce the rest of this panel. Connor, if you would please take it away.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Mario and Joel. It's nice when there's so much content that it flows over, because then we just have free content for the next event. It's already done. So I'm going to start by introducing our illustrious panel here. Marta Belcher, to start with, is the General Counsel and Head of Policy at Protocol Labs. She's the board chair of the Filecoin Foundation and the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. She also serves as a special counsel to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Marvin Ammori is the Chief Legal Officer at UNISWAP and a civil liberties advocate and scholar best known for his work on network neutrality and internet freedom issues. And Marc Boiron, he's the General Counsel of DYDX, an open crypto trading platform. Prior to joining DYDX, Marc was doing a ton of work in blockchain as the securities and blockchain attorney at Manat, Phelps, and Phillips. With that, I will kick it off immediately into questions, because I know we're going to get a lot of great answers from this group. To start with, the question that I posed to you guys previously and provided written answers, which we send out to the group, but I think it'd be great to re-engage with this question, because I think it's going to be one of the most important ones, for at least 5 to 10 minutes. How should the DAO community prioritize use of limited resources to enable DAOs to operate with a higher degree of legal clarity? And maybe let's start with Marvin on this one.
Thanks, Connor. Thanks for inviting me. I think there's been a really good example with the uni governance community, where there was a proposal by the Harvard Law School Blockchain and FinTech Initiative to fund a DeFi education fund. Right? And the idea behind the fund is to set up an organization, a team that can direct funds for educating policymakers around the world on all things DeFi and anything that might touch on DeFi regulation, including crypto where it affects DeFi. So to me, this is an amazing use of funds. It's very outsized impact. When you look at some of the things holding back the adoption of DeFi and cryptocurrency, and even legal clarity around how to govern these communities when it comes to DAOs and smart contracts. This is money very, very well spent. In fact, I sort of have a preference for getting money out into the community and to folks who can do something with it, even ahead of, I guess I'm a fan of treasury fund management. I think everyone thinks they're good at managing funds and giant pools of money. But to me, I'd rather see the money in DAOs be deployed relatively quickly out in the community rather than, doing with them.
Marta, Marc, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I entirely agree with Marvin on what he said. The thing I'd add in terms of how to think about this is right now we're at a point where DAOs, in a way they've existed for a long time, right? You could go pre the DAO, but you can easily point to the DAO, but not at scale in the way that we see them now. And so what exists right now is a lot of low hanging fruit on just DAOs and what they mean from like a liability perspective and from a tax perspective, from an operational perspective, there's a lot of things that need to be figured out. And while there's like some differences across DAOs, almost all DAOs are trying to figure out the exact same issues. And most of them are doing it with some little discussions and coordination, but a lot of independent efforts. And I just think there's an opportunity for DAOs to work together more collaboratively and reach conclusions that, frankly, all DAOs will benefit from, kind of the efficiencies that they would get from working together on these issues. And so, I think that's one of them. And I think the DeFi Education Fund, I think, particularly is interesting in that, it's trying to solve an issue that, frankly, isn't just particular to Uniswap, although, I mean, it would have a probably a disproportionate impact on Uniswap. But that's part of the reason why the DeFi Education goal is not just for the Uniswap treasury to fund it, but also for other DAOs to fund it as well. And that's just kind of one example of DAOs kind of working together on an issue that clearly impacts everybody in a very similar way.
I would add that I think that there are questions about liability that really apply to DAOs even when they're not about DAOs. So there are all sorts of places where you're seeing regulators and lawmakers grapple with where to assign liability in a decentralized world. So just as one example, the SEC brought an action against EtherDelta, which was a decentralized exchange. And it was really interesting to see the language that they were using about where the liability falls when you're talking about decentralized technology. And so in that particular instance, they actually wrote, the SEC actually wrote that anyone who provides an algorithm can be liable for violating securities laws. And so that was, I think, a particularly egregious case where you can see how the SEC is grappling with these questions of liability. And in that particular case, Rainey Reitman and Aaron Mackey and I and others at EFF wrote to the SEC to basically say, we actually think that language you're using is a violation of the First Amendment. But I don't think that that's going to be the last time that we have these types of this type of language that is seeking to really take liability in a decentralized world and put it places it shouldn't be. So I think that the community should be really keeping an eye out for those types of situations, and even outside, specifically cases involving DAOs.
Super helpful. And so now in reflecting on, and Marc, I really love your point about DAOs cooperating, and it's a great opportunity for me to indirectly plug the DAO Research Cooperative, of course. But at the same time, I would love to see what kind of traction you're seeing on that cooperation front. Obviously, you guys didn't make the DeFi Education Fund proposal, but some of you may have been following it. And so what is your sense of the appetite for other DAOs to work together? Obviously, I imagine you know much more about it from maybe the legal regulatory advocacy side, but even more broadly, what have you been seeing?
Well, how about I jump in? I think that was a question for Marc, but I'll jump in and say nice things about Marc, which is, the DeFi Education Fund, the proposal included 7 members on the committee who could direct the funds to the highest uses. And I mean, it's an all-star team, right? It includes Marc at DYDX. It's, they don't have a DAO at the moment, but it's another leading project, and we talk quite a bit. Rebecca Redig, the head lawyer at the AAVE companies, which launched the AAVE protocol, and the AAVE protocol obviously has a DAO. And a set of other people who've thought about DAOs, Jake Chervinsky from Compound, obviously. It's also, all of us borrow their governance system. So that's definitely collaboration. And I think the more, often collaboration works kind of step by step, right? You begin with everyone on the same committee, working together, people on the same, kind of rowing in the same direction. And then it can lead to those communities saying, hey, this thing is working, and it has been working. and we can contribute funding or we can contribute in other ways, right? It doesn't have to only be financing when it comes to some of these political or legal matters. It could be other coordination. Now, one thing that I was thinking about is you could also have DAOs not collaborating with each other, kind of attacking each other in kind of a, I'd say short-term, closed-minded game theory, right? Where some folks from one rival project or a fork decide to try to get into the discussions and the debates that are going on over the Treasury, allocation or a proposal for one DAO. So imagine if, lawyers for or token holders for one project are trying to spread FUD, dishonesty, etc., in the proposal of a rival DAO, right? Let's say that were to happen. I mean, the interesting thing is, we're working out a lot of things when it comes to DAOs, but having the votes align with token holders and that kind of alignment is almost like the way to, it's the way that, you have an economic incentive essentially to thwart these kinds of attacks. So even if you have a bunch of trolls and nonsense and FUD, the folks who actually have real alignment are going to vote in favor of proposals that make sense. So, when I look at even the DeFi Education Fund proposal, that passed overwhelmingly. It was like 80 million to 15 million. And there were some legitimate questions. And I think, the question around delegation and oversight, these are really fascinating questions. But I do think that a lot of the FUD was from folks who had almost no alignment. And it was good to see, essentially the community rebuff an attack filled with some FUD on the edges.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, like, point to the DeFi Education Fund is like one good example of like the beginning of collaboration like that. It is worth backing up and saying, like, have we actually had a lot of collaboration in the past? And in a way we have, right? So we see a ton of, right, if you take it from a technical perspective, right, like all the composability and integrations that you see across DeFi, a lot of that is actually like one DAO integrating with another, right? If Yearn be maybe the best example of one that's do that. That's a form of collaboration. And it's the form that like most naturally happens in a technical kind of ecosystem. And so that's existed. And questions like, what about on the social layer rather than the technical layer? And I think the social layer is where I think we're starting to see that. And I think, again, the DeFi Education Fund is an example of that. I just think that there's an opportunity for even more of that to happen at the social layer. Because we definitely have it at the technical layer, and we see like the massive benefits of that. And I think you can get it on the social layer too.
No, thank you. I mean, I would love to keep diving more into the cooperation aspect. I want to get to a couple more things, but definitely agree with you on its importance. So Marta, this is kind of at a thread that you mentioned. So we obviously have a lot of folks at the summit today who are active in building DAOs, who work on teams that run DAOs, who contribute to governance in DAOs. And so I've fielded a lot of questions from folks in that camp who are thinking about like legal risks that they may be, that they may be opening themselves up to by virtue of the work that they do. Like, do you have a sense of how those folks should think about mitigating those risks for themselves and the organizations they work for?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one big one is the advocacy piece that we've already really, we've done a deep dive into. And I would really emphasize that the keeping the concept that code is First Amendment protected speech alive is very important in the US for ensuring that liability doesn't fall places it shouldn't. And I would also say, just from at a less large scale, I think that the DAO community should really be doubling down on efforts to have DAOs recognized by laws in various jurisdictions. So similar to Wyoming's new DAO LLC law, I think that even if these laws aren't perfect, having this kind of legal recognition is a really good step towards legitimacy and will really help with policy efforts in the future. And I think that Wyoming's law, for example, really does do something to help address individual concerns about liability.
Marc and Marvin, maybe, yeah, I don't know if you have further thoughts on that, or also would next love to kind of dive into the formal versus the informally associated DAOs.
Well, so the question is an important one. It's a question of, developers worry about their legal risk when it comes to working on a DAO. As Marta said, one of the ways to reduce that legal risk is to support policy efforts. One, obviously the DeFi Education Fund will, I think, be very helpful. There's lots of other efforts out there that it will be funding that exist, like Coin Center, and Fight for the Future is very active on the activism side. Blockchain Association, DeFi Alliance, there's a whole group of them that are working towards this. And sort of being supportive of those efforts. There are moments where, them being a constituent of a particular person, or them kind of contributing in a certain way, or building a tool even for activism could be useful. So one, on the policy side. Two, I think it is important to know that, the law exists, right? Like I was like an early internet lawyer. And I remember when Larry Lessig wrote the book Code. I remember reading it, and it's it's when there's a famous line, "Code is law," and explains how code can shape behavior, along with other things that were not code. And what we learned over the decades of the internet is that code is not law, right? It affects behavior, but law is law. People knocking on your door and arresting you is law, and people finding you, threatening you with force, that's law. And all of the early internet companies that thought they could sort of operate without borders and do whatever they wanted and just focus on the code were actually wrong, right? There were limits and there were restrictions. Obviously, as Marta mentioned, code has First Amendment protection, but there are cases where, despite that protection, people lose, and sometimes they win. So there are some existing legal tools that are kind of behind the curtain that people don't even notice, right? So Marta mentioned the Wyoming bill and like maybe incorporating as an LLC under Wyoming. And that to some people seems like, oh man, we don't need no stinking corporations. But corporations aren't straitjackets, they're like Iron Man suits. They actually protect you. You can be a vigilante, but you get all these protections, liability protections, all this cool stuff. You might want to think through, hey, is there a way to get the purposes we need for this DAO of governance and mass participation, while doing it effectively under law, while we're changing laws to make them apply better to us. So I don't think people, and when you look at a lot of companies, right, I think people realize most of the companies they interact with probably have dozens, hundreds of entities under them, right? Google probably has an entity for everything they do under the hood for every country, for different kinds of products, right? There are lots of ways. Venture funds, all the venture capitalists that are going to be speaking today or at crypto conferences who have a big following, they have multiple different entities for every fund they do, right? And so under the hood, people will use entities for their benefit. And I don't think the community should be opposed to using an entity where it furthers the purpose of the DAO, if you structure the governance the right way, if you come up with a few little innovations. So I guess what I'm saying is, we might as well use the law to our benefit rather than against us in a way that furthers our real principles that really matter, which are not avoiding entities, but really participation, community ownership, kind of open source development.
The thing I'd add is about kind of being meaningful and thoughtful in how you approach it. So, when you create a, 4 of 7 multi-sig to start a DAO, and that it is going to be developed, the entire software code within that DAO, and then deployed from that DAO, and then grow the community from that DAO. There are so many different layers of risk that exist in what you're doing at that time. That is very different from a DAO that exists, and more particularly 7 identifiable people in most cases, including those who want to be anons but don't successfully do it. And so I think there's a very big difference between a DAO that is 7, 10, 20, 30 people even, and a DAO that is 100,000 token holders or more. In terms of who's the actor, what risks are they taking? I think when you have such a small group, it's a lot more problematic. On top of that, when you look at some of the risks with respect to DAOs, like around partnership and liability type issues, there's like, a definition of when something constitutes a partnership and when it doesn't. And what stage that DAO is at, whether it receives fees or not, things like that are actually going to play in, and communications between DAO members and what their intentions are. That's going to play into potentiality for the DAO members. So I guess my point is just that you need to be like intentional in how you create these and when you create them and what activity you're taking or you're engaging in as a DAO, versus when it is that maybe you should be using an entity and then at some point distribute a token, become a DAO, or when it might be appropriate to be a DAO with a legal entity, as a legal entity right off the bat. So I think it is it's not ideal to say it's like situational and depends on the circumstances, but I think everybody wants to approach things in different ways and have different values. Some believe that from the beginning it should be a DAO because that's just more consistent with the ethos. That just brings different risks. And so I think people need to be cognizant of that.
And I mean, to that point, so I think this is a really interesting question. And I've definitely happened upon this a few times in helping just help teams think through who they need to be in touch with, like what lawyers they should connect with and how they should think about some of the issues that are flagged for them early. But a lot of them don't have anyone to really flag those issues for them. So they just start building and then they all of a sudden have a DAO and then maybe they have $1 billion AUM and, one thing sort of leads to another. So how do you think, and this is maybe a difficult question, but to your point about this being situational, it's difficult to hand out a guide to all crypto teams and say, hey, here are the best practices in forming a DAO, because it strikes me that we're not there yet. How do we communicate this to the community in a way that can help mitigate risk for individuals who are trying to build, amazing products?
I mean, from my perspective, it's about identifying those who are handling DAO matters in a way that are consistent with the way that you view them, right? And, ideally, if you go to one team that is doing that, talk to them, like that's probably not enough because maybe they're doing everything wrong. And so I think the key is to speak to, look, this is not a community that's like hard to get in touch with people and pick their brains on like what they're doing and how they approach it. And so, I think it's important to identify those who are doing things in a way that you think are good, go talk to them. And usually you have a pretty good idea of whether they're just flying by the seat of the pants or whether they've actually paid attention to these things. And if you talk to a broad enough group of folks who have been involved in DAOs, you'll start getting a pretty good idea of what to do. And eventually you'll run into a lawyer who might give you an idea about how to think about some liability risk protections, and then hopefully introduce you to a lawyer who will be able to help you.
Yeah, I think where Marc ended is where which is you at some point you want an outside lawyer probably to help you. If you're early on, somebody whose job it is to advise you and has a fiduciary obligation to you and all that stuff, attorney-client privilege. The problem is I can't just say, hey, call this lawyer at X law firm, because you should begin with talking to projects whose DAO structure you like and find out who they used. One of the issues is a lot of these good lawyers get taken in-house. Marc used to be my outside lawyer. Now he's in-house somewhere. Marta was, when I was at Protocol Labs, our outside lawyer. Then we hired her in-house. And they just keep shuffling. And all the good lawyers get snatched up. There's like 2 or 3 left. But we have to use outside counsel too. And so ask around, the latest lawyer who's good before they go in-house, we will connect you to. And hopefully they can be helpful. Now, this is also where I say nice things about Connor, right? Connor, you have a project you're setting up to help people think through DAOs. And I think that would be very, very valuable, right? Because it seems like it's not going anywhere, unlike my outside counsel who always goes somewhere. So Connor, why don't you just remind everyone what you're setting up?
Yeah, and so we're setting up the DAO Research Cooperative, which is a group that pools funding from multiple DAOs. Right now, we have contributions from AAVE, Compound, and UNISWAP grants, and it uses that capital to research some of the issues that are key to many DAOs at this stage, and then provide white papers at this stage in response, which could be really the foundational building blocks. So the things that we build legal advice upon in many ways. But I almost want to turn the question back to you guys. You know, if you're interested in DAO Research Cooperative, of course, reach out to me on Twitter. But very practically speaking, and I think it's a great point you make, Marvin, and I've certainly heard tons of different lawyers complain about the fact, different GCs complain about the fact that all the best lawyers are being pulled in-house, including they're complaining about Marc, they're complaining about Marta, they're complaining about Jake, of course, et cetera, many others. But if you are a crypto project today, how do you go about, so obviously you connect with pro you like and whose structures you respect and want to imitate. But when you're speaking to the few lawyers that are available in this space, like, should you approach those few lawyers who are currently really burdened with many other clients and can just charge infinite amounts of money? Or should you take a flyer on a new lawyer who isn't as well-versed in the space, or maybe doesn't have the same reputation? How do you make that decision as a non-legal person? And I know that's a tough question.
Yeah. So let me say, I wasn't quite complaining about Marc and Marta. Their lives are much better now that they're in-house and they can.
Sorry, I should have clarified. They're complaining about Marvin for getting these people brought in-house, so they're no longer.
But I had nothing to do with Marc being in-house. I tried to keep them outside against the interests of the greater community, in my interest. But for the greater community, they can get a lot more done in-house, right? And it's good. All the better people going in-house is better for the community. So what people should do if they're looking for a lawyer, I mean, as Marc said, in this community, you'll know other people in the community. They know you, right? Calling you and chatting with you, you probably will have the latest information. Not to volunteer your time. But if they are close to any projects who have lawyers on staff or who've gone through setting up DAOs, I think they ask that kind of advice. You know, in order to, you're sort of asking, are there some kind of specialists, smaller lawyers they could go for versus some of these bigger firms? It's hard to know, but it's so a lot of the bigger projects do use bigger firms, because if you're dealing in the crypto industry, there is no crypto law. There's there's corporate law and transactional law and derivatives and tax and securities and subspecialties of all of them. And the biggest firms tend to have whole teams. And that's why a lot of times some of the better outside crypto lawyers will go to some of the bigger firms, because that way they have a whole bunch of a whole team behind them. So you could do well with a smaller shop if there's like a really excellent generalist, but often you'll see at least bigger projects going to bigger firms, right? And if I were someone who was not a lawyer and was building in the space, I would honestly call you or somebody else who I thought would be receptive if I knew them.
Very fair. Okay, last question. So recently we've seen some foundations transition into DAOs. And obviously this is the aspiration of many foundations, maybe most famously of late, a Maker has transitioned into a DAO. So how do you guys think that organizations generally should think about when the right time to transition is, taking into account, I'm sure, obviously the legal piece, but then maybe the governance piece from what you've seen with projects you've worked with, or other considerations projects should keep in mind?
Marta or Marc, do you want to talk about transition?
Sure. I mean, I think Maker is one example where they're doing it very gradually, which I think is important to go from centralized to decentralized. I think they recognize that it really needs to be a step-by-step process, so that you can protect against any threats to the long-term existence of the decentralization, protecting against power vacuums and providing stability, particularly when you have a bunch of partners in the space. You need to make sure that those partners feel safe with and that there aren't sort of sudden changes. So I think doing it gradually in this case, as Maker is doing, it really makes sense. And I think that it's also a process with really teaching the community how they can contribute to governance in a way that is the most effective as well.
Yeah, I think what we saw, if you go back to like 2017, this wasn't necessarily DAOs, but it wasn't all that different. But what we saw was an attempt to immediately decentralize projects. It was this idea of like, hey, we're going to raise money and then we're magically going to be decentralized one day. And what we saw is like that didn't work, right? You need some kind of traction. You need some actually advance communities forwards, bring things forwards. Like it completely failed. And so I think what we've seen more now, and part of this is when you're not creating a network and you're instead creating like a protocol on top of a network, I think that it's a little more difficult, but you've seen more of a move towards like this progressive decentralization as Marta was touching on. And when that's the case, I think that there's a few key parts to this. I think one is the size of the community that you have, I think is important, right? I think, you know, if you've got like a very small community that's not very passionate, like it's probably hard to create a DAO that isn't just a, you know, massive liability risk, but effectively what you still already had. I think that once your community is more developed, you're in a much better spot to be able to do that. I also think that there's, you know, a question in terms of like just development, in terms of like development risk around the protocol, right? I think that when you've kind of worked out a lot of the development risk, probably makes a lot more sense to have, you know, a DAO that is working, you know, on the code and other aspects of the protocol, than when you still have like very key aspects of the protocol that still need to be developed. The third thing I'd say is like one that I think is important for regulatory and liability purposes, which is like kind of touches on the same point as the first one, but it's this, you know, idea of like having a more active community. I think one of the biggest risks of a DAO is this like re-centralization of you know what is going to happen, whether it's marketing, business development, or like technical development. You know, there's a tendency, because for efficiency, to just centralize everything in one group. Like that's just how organizations have historically worked. And I think there needs to be like significant efforts in terms of like decentralization or decentralizing responsibility, right? When we see like grant DAOs, like as kind of sub DAOs being formed, that I think help. I think when you are seeing like grants actually being made, which creates kind of a more active community, because those who receive the grants are then more likely to participate. I think all of these and others are ways to incentivize participation in the community, which allows for a stronger, more active DAO that I think reduces the risk of this kind of re-centralization that creates, I think, regulatory risk and like easy like liability targets.
I think it's great answering. Almost like pull out one of those threads is around the idea. So you mentioned at the top of your answer, like the one thing I realized relatively recently was that even though I came into crypto and started working as, you know, formerly a lawyer and now as a non-lawyer in this space, but obviously keeping a tab on legals, is that the idea that that some things are done, like some things are thought through. I think people make assumptions sometimes in this space that like, I remember when I came in 3.5 years ago, governance was done. We had someone who was working on governance and they had it, and we didn't need to worry about it. Progressive decentralization was baked, like we were good to go. And I think it's a really important reminder to everyone in this community that you have to keep building and researching and providing information to the community more broadly if you want things to actually change and evolve, and don't assume that questions you may think that have been answered or feats accomplished, because a lot of the time it hasn't been. And someone might say it on Twitter, but it doesn't mean it's actually happened. And so you should be very critical in your thinking, but also you should be a contributor to building in this space if you want to see it move forward. And then you should make sure to open source that contribution, from my perspective. And yeah, and I think the guys with that, we're at time. and I wouldn't want to cut out from our next fireside chat. So thanks so much, Marta, Marc, and Marvin. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know if people do eventually want to reach out to you, I know that you're all on Twitter and can be relatively easily found, right?
Yep.
That's right.
We can, yeah. And thanks, Connor.
Thanks so much, all.
Thanks.
All right. Coming up next, we have Dan Boneh, who is going to be interviewing Robert Leshner. Dan Boneh is the co-director of the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research and a professor of computer science and electrical engineering at Stanford University. You guys saw him at the beginning of the event. And Robert Leshner is the founder of Compound, big advocate for DeFi, one of my personal favorite investors in this space, and also is an investor over at Robert Ventures. And we are going to be speaking about the future of DAOs. Pretty broad topic, you guys. Take it away.
Perfect. Thank you. Wow, this has been going great so far. Robert, it's great to see you again. How are you?
Dan, doing great. Excited to talk about DAOs, DeFi, and the future of the world.
Exactly. So Robert, you started Compound. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Compound, just to make sure everybody's on the same page?
Yeah, so Compound is an interest rate market for Ethereum assets built with smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. So you can think of it like a financial market that runs autonomously on its own 24/7, built with open source computer programs that anyone can interact with, build on top of, and nowadays govern.
Yep, perfect. That's exactly what I was going to jump into next. So Compound is a DAO. It has a governance mechanism. Can you talk a little bit about how the governance mechanism works in DAO?
Yeah,
in Compound?
Yeah, so Compound started off as an interest rate market parameters, which assets are supported, what are the interest rate models that each market, functions by, and what are certain parameters, like how useful is an asset as collateral. So there's a whole list of variables and parameters that comprise these markets. And there's also the ability to add new functionality and features, add additional contracts, and change the behavior of the system. So originally, our team that built the protocol was the one who set these parameters. We did so by listening to the community and taking, their input. But at the end of the day, if a parameter had to change, there was only one team that was capable of making a change, whether it's something really simple or something complex, like changing the functionality of the protocol. Today, Compound is actually governed by token holders with no middlemen whatsoever. So token holders have the ability to create proposals which can change the parameters or code of the protocol itself and vote on these changes directly on chain. It's a system that's designed to let the community, actually suggest and build and implement changes. If there's, a new market, it's possible that the team that created that asset might actually, do the work to add the asset to Compound. It doesn't require, Compound Labs. And second, it allows people, when they're governing Compound, to reach an agreement on which changes are good and which changes are bad. And, certain, changes are relatively easy to reason about, like, oh, let's, add this market. Everyone can say, hey, it's a great idea. Let's add a new asset. Or it could be complex. Let's change the risk factors that determine whether or not the protocol is risky or conservative. And so token holders vote on these things. And all changes at the end of the day are actually computer code. So whether it's changing a parameter or saying switch to using a new smart contract to govern some type of logic, all of it is basically voting on whether or not different parameters and lines of code get merged into the protocol.
I think that's really actually important to point out, that you could literally switch to a completely new contract if the community votes to do that. Yeah, so you can change the logic altogether.
Exactly. What you can't do, and this is interesting and different from a lot of DAOs, is you can't do anything off chain. So you can't have like proposals that say like, oh, please go out and build X, Y, and Z. Like the governors of the protocol are strictly governing the contracts deployed onto the blockchain. There's no proposals that are like, let's change the logo. It's all proposals like, what are the variables and parameters that we'd like to see modified.
So before we talk about the specifics of the governance, I think this was touched on in the last panel, but I think it'd be good to hear from you as well. like, why did you make this change? Like initially Compound was in control of everything. It could still solicit proposals from the public, and then it would just decide itself what to implement and what not to. Why did you make it so that you're out of the loop?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really two major advantages that I see to doing direct on-chain governance of a system. One is resilience. So, and to determine resilience, I actually use a test called the meteor test. It's a little bit silly, but the idea is if a meteor came down from outer space and landed on the Compound office, would the protocol continue to run? And the answer is actually really important. So, you want to build resilience into like a financial market. So the answer is yes, like unequivocally. Like if a meteor comes down, the thing will continue to run forever. The really cool thing about, applications built on the Ethereum blockchain is the answer, even when it was still managed by our team, was generally yes, but only in a short time. So if a meteor came down and knocked out the whole Compound team, the protocol itself would continue to operate. It doesn't require any humans on a day-to-day basis, but the economic parameters of it would go stale. So you wouldn't see like the market evolving to the risk levels and the parameters of the crypto market itself. So eventually the answer is if a meteor came down, and it was centralized, you wouldn't notice that day, but a year later, the system might no longer be operating efficiently.
I have to add, like, just from a technical point of view, in that world, what controlled the protocol is a cryptographic signing key that allowed you to make updates. If the meteor came down and destroyed that key, the protocol can no longer be changed.
Exactly. Or if the people who hold the key are gone.
Yeah, it's not the people, it's the key.
Exactly.
That's the key.
That's exactly right. It's the key. Yeah. And so that's the first goal, is resiliency. You always want to make it so that somebody is around with the rights to upgrade it in perpetuity. It's not dependent on any one team or person. And that's, adds a lot of like robustness to the protocols. If it's going to be there working in, 50 years, you can build systems on top of it that are designed to last for 50 years. If, it's very fragile, you can build great things on top of a system like Compound, or you can use it as an individual user, but you can't build it into larger systems designed to last forever. So resilience is the first goal. The second goal is actually, I think, less intuitive, but that's by removing one privileged party able to upgrade a system and open it up to one in which anyone can design and create upgrades to the system, you theoretically increase the rate of innovation. Now, this is debatable. But it's one of the core theories behind how we design governance and the actual mechanisms of how we built the system on chain. It's designed so that if someone listening to this talk right now says, "Oh, I found an opportunity to improve Compound," lines 112 through 130 of this contract are inefficient. I found a way to make this more efficient. Anyone can bring that improvement to the protocol. It's not bottlenecked by just our team. It's actually opened to an entire community. And it's trying to hopefully harness the absolute best properties of open source software, which is anyone can make improvements to it. Now you have to convince a community that it's a good idea and get their approval before you do it. But if you identify an opportunity to improve the protocol, it's not bottlenecked and it doesn't require the permission of anybody at all to implement it. As long as you can convince the token holders that it's a good idea, you can make an improvement. Obviously, it doesn't happen necessarily without like economic incentives and grants. So one of the things that's come up in the last 6 months has been a grants committee to actually reward open source contributions to the protocol. But when all of this comes together, you get a system that doesn't have fragility and is upgradable by a larger community. And there's the reasons and incentives to improve this protocol. We're left with a system that can continuously improve and improve forever. So ideally in 20 years, if this experiment, is completed successfully, in 20 years, Compound's going to be far superior to the Compound that you have today.
Mm-hmm. So actually, when it comes to that, the one question that's always on everybody's mind is, communities don't always make the right decisions. In particular, we've seen examples in history where, a community decides to appoint a dictator that is going to be presumably a benevolent dictator, but that's going to control everything from now on. In principle, that could happen, right? So what do you do if a community makes a bad decision or decides to centralize?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've always taken what I would call like the extreme approach to building on-chain systems, which is, it's followed a model of like progressive decentralization, but towards an extreme. Community has absolute control, and like whatever they decide goes. We've done this with some training wheels. So one of the things that's been forgotten a little bit is that when we created this on-chain governance system, we actually tested it, with select members of the community first. So we basically said we're going to have full on-chain governance, but it's not going to be open to every single user of the protocol. It's going to be tested, in the wild with, people that only have positive goals and motivations. And then after on-chain governance ran successfully for 3 months, we then opened it up to the entire community and said, all right, we've pulled the lever, there's no going back. This is it.
Unless the community votes for going back.
Unless the community votes for going back. Hopefully that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I actually think, the system is generally working quite well today. We've seen a number of different teams and contributors like actually upgrading Compound, whether it's small things like parameters or large things like new contracts or markets or functionality. And so I actually think this model is sort of the direction of the future, which is like, if you can build a system that's open to the whole world, it's going to move, faster or have greater acceleration than a system which, is, permissioned and run by,
I want to talk about another aspect of this, which is participation. So one of the things that I think is really exciting is that if you look at the Compound governance dashboard, you'll see that there are many universities that are contributing to, they're voting on proposals, contributing analysis, and so on. Like the Stanford Blockchain Club is very actively engaged in voting on Compound proposals. So I have to say, this is an incredible educational tool. I don't think this was the intent, right? But by making it so that by delegating votes to students, we all have students analyzing proposals and learning much more about the DeFi space by the process of analysis. So I think, I don't know if the audience is aware of this, but it's worthwhile looking at the Compound voters. You'll see there are many universities involved. Was that by design, or did that just kind of happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So delegation was by design. So what's funny is when you think back to the ancient history, prehistoric era of 2019, when we started designing, this transition to decentralized governance, there weren't too many examples of protocol governance. It was very early. So at the time, we had very few examples to learn from. So we learned a lot from the MakerDAO community. I'm actually a huge, fan of MakerDAO and MKR holder. That was one of the very first, what I would say, like on-chain governance systems. It had some flaws that we wanted to, learn from. We actually really liked some of the governance structures of the Tezos blockchain. That was one of the inspirations for it. We looked a lot at other layer ones. We looked a lot at, corporate governance of like listed equities in the US and abroad. We looked at a number of different governance systems to design Compound governance for what we thought a useful and stable, and mature on-chain governance system would look like. One of the key pieces of that was this active delegation. And so, what we envisioned originally was that, most people by nature, their job is not to monitor or manage, a financial market protocol on a blockchain. There's some people that are going to be unbelievably passionate about this, but the average participant or even user doesn't really care. They just want it to run correctly. And so one of the core ideas was that, there should be a separation of the sort of ownership and rights to govern and the participation itself. And that delegation fills this gap. And what we wanted was a system in which, the people that were going to be super active, and like really spend a lot of time in like, getting to know the Compound protocol and like how it works and the code base and the metrics and the, risk parameters of it. Like those are the ones who should have a lot of votes and a lot of control. But they might not be the ones with a lot of ownership, and that's fine. And that's a good thing. And delegation allows you to take your tokens and ownership and assign the expertise elsewhere. And if you want to participate in Compound governance directly, phenomenal, right? Like that's even better. But if you have comp tokens, you can assign the votes to yourself or to Dan or to Stanford Blockchain Club or to literally, anyone on earth that you want, including other computer programs. And the idea was that by building essentially a very simple tool, the world would figure out the best way to use it. And that's come up as academic organizations being large delegates. It's really cool to see. But it's also actually, sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say, but it's also actually come up in a little bit in sort of machine-driven governance as well. And this is more counter-intuitive things, but we actually thought that governance would go to people like predominantly. One of the most popular use cases actually has come up where people are delegating to ideas. And eventually maybe they'll delegate to like,
Don't say AI. Don't say AI.
AI or whatever. But they're delegating to ideas right now. And so, in compound governance, we have these things called autonomous proposals. It's like, it's an idea in a smart contract that says, if I get enough governance votes or governance power, I'm going to create a proposal for the community. And so you could delegate to like this idea, like, oh, let's add, I don't know, some asset, tether, to the protocol. And if that receives enough delegation, it can actually create governance for the community. It seems a little bit like AI, as Dan mentioned, but it's not. But it's one of the first examples of like delegating governance of a protocol, not to a person, but to another computer program. And it's really cool as a use case.
It's really, really cool. Yeah, really cool ideas. So this is great, but we're coming up on time, but there's really one question I have to ask you. We're supposed to also talk about the future of DAOs and kind of where they're headed, which I guess you kind of touched on in the last answer. But I kind of want to ask you, in the vein of the future of DAOs, if somebody was starting a DAO today, what sort of advice would you give them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of different types of DAOs right now. I'm focused on protocol DAOs. There's great DAOs that are collecting art or being social organizations or investing into different things. I think the thing to think about are what actions does your collective have to take? With Compound, it's simple: manage the protocol parameters. In others, it's making like investment decisions. Are we buying this piece of art or not? Or what are we doing in this way? Are we investing in like this asset? And you should design the sort of on-chain systems and off-chain systems for a DAO for the purpose of what you're trying to achieve. I think right now, a lot of the technology of DAOs is very early. There's great tools for voting. There's very bad tools right now for carrying out the outcome of votes. So I've seen a lot of DAOs like voting on like, what do we do as a group? And then relying on the humans to enforce those decisions. I think the thing to think about is how can you like productionalize this and institutionalize the DAO such that it doesn't still have to come back to relying on humans to carry out the will of, a community. The more you can make this not rely on humans, I think the more powerful DAOs are going to become.
Yeah, and in fact, I guess the compound governance mechanism is a good source to learn from, right? There, the proposals are enforced actually by the code, not there's no humans involved.
Yep.
So that's a really good example. Fantastic. Actually, I think we're at time, so this went by really quickly. So thank you so much for coming, Robert. This was fantastic. It's great to see you again, and it's wonderful to see all the things that Compound has achieved. And yeah, looking forward to what you guys do in the future.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah,
great talking about this.
David, back to you.
Fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed that one. Coming up next, we have a conversation about DAO Treasury Management and management best practices, moderated by myself. And we also have Kinjal Shah, who is an investor at Blockchain Capital, investing in the future of crypto assets and blockchains. And she is also the co-founder of Cooperative. I might need help on that pronunciation, which is a DAO investing in female and non-binary crypto founders. We also have Derek Hsue, who is a co-founder of Reverie, a company that helps DAOs scale. And prior to founding Reverie, he was an investor at Blockchain Capital. We also have Matthew Graham, who is the Treasury Working Group lead at Index Co-op, a community-led initiative focusing on enabling the creation and adoption of crypto indices, primitives, and a core contributor at Llama. We also are missing a panelist who might show up halfway through the show, and if that happens, then I will introduce them then. But until then, guys, welcome to this panel. We are going to be talking all about DAO Treasury Management, and I want to start off with a really broad, high-level question. Why is this question so important? Why is there a conversation at all about the relationship between DAOs and their own treasuries? And I want to give each of the panelists here a moment to answer. And let's go ahead and start with Derek, because you are on the top left. Derek, why is this question important?
Thanks, Dave, for moderating. I think that at the simplest level, people see the sheer size and scale of these DAO treasuries and realize that there's enormous potential on how they can be used to improve the long-term prospects of a protocol. Now that there's many DeFi protocols with product market fit, and there's fundamental value being created for the token and via just continuous fees, there's a much bigger importance in sort of actually leveraging what you can essentially think of as a company balance sheet to improve both the core product and the core ecosystem of users, of community, which sort of can appear to be pretty similar. So there's lots of different approaches to this, but that's sort of my thoughts on it.
Kinjal, same question to you. When the conversation of treasury management and DAOs comes up, why is this such a big deal? What's at stake here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this might be a little bit repetitive with what Derek said, but I really think of DAOs as a new way of operating online, right? It's a new sort of structure for coordination, and in order to ensure the health and longevity of whatever it is that you're kind of governing, I think you have to do some work around capital allocation. And so over the past 18 months, we've seen treasuries absolutely balloon up. I think DAOs are now in possession of over $10 billion worth of assets. And so I come back to the fundamental question of, if I have a company, what do I want to do? Make sure I have enough operating capital to invest into my products and my roadmap, ensure that there's alignment with all of my shareholders or equity holders, or in this case, token holders, and then make sure that I have a way to sort of elongate our long-term financial health through diversification or investments or whatever that might look like. So that's a little bit more of like a boomer definition of like, how does a company even work? But I think that's generally how I think DAOs are starting to think about treasury management, and it's important because we want them to grow.
Matthew, I want to also give you the same question, but also we on the Bankless podcast, we talked to Joel Monegro, who was an early panelist here, and he really talked about how if you only govern over things that are worth governing over, and so there is no such thing as governing over things that aren't valuable. And so to some degree, all DAOs are governance mechanisms, and they're governing over assets. So my question to you is a little bit different. Is this kind of the whole point about DAOs? Is how can DAOs manage the assets that they have on their balance sheet? Is this kind of the prime question as to what a DAO really is trying to do?
I think the prime thing the DAO is trying to do is probably build their community out and deliver their products and their edge to the market, and contribute to DeFi, and well, at least some of them are, and then go from there. And the treasury really becomes a tool to help them on that journey, to help build their community out, help get their governance tokens distributed, the products out there. It's just a financial capital. It's a tool of just way of helping the DAO and the community achieve their goals and where they want to go. So yeah, they just can let the community go where it wants to go, and then use the treasury as a way of helping it get there. And then also give it a bit of a backstop, so that if the market does turn, it can keep striving towards those goals independent of the market conditions.
Matthew, the Index Co-op DAO has always impressed me with its level of sophistication and organization. And so I want to keep on talking to you here. What have you seen be successful strategies or successful treasury management strategies inside of Index Co-op, and perhaps what you've also seen in other DAOs as well?
Yeah, the Index Co-op School, really fortunate. There's a really high energy, really active community there. And when it comes to finances, it's something everybody seems to have an opinion on. So trying to bring a big community to form consensus around what to do is a little bit challenging. There's a lot of discussions and a lot of opinions around it. Something Index Group's done really well. After launching the governance token, recently we've just started diversifying our treasury, which is basically to go from pure governance token to basically have some stables allocation in there, which is enough to sustain the community, independent of what happens to our governance token price, which is really exciting. That's our set for the next few years.
Derek, same question to you. What have you seen as successful DAO treasury management strategies? And are there any DAOs out there that you really think are pioneering like good management practices?
Yeah, I think the way to that question is to think about the goals of a DAO, right? Which is to, at the end of the day, find the best people and incentivize them with capital and ensure that in a bear market, like this protocol has the resources to do that. I think YFI is a pretty sort of great example of this specifically, where their entire approach to treasury management and basically governance as a whole is centered around the question, how do we actually retain and incentivize the talented devs working for us long-term, regardless of market conditions? And I think of around 6 months ago, when they did the sort of 20% mint to sort of as part of the core dev fund, like that's treasury management. It's not sort of conventional like diversification, earning yield, like that's another category. But I think YFI has sort of done this pretty well, where they created this sort of fund, built consensus around that idea, and have allocated initially small amounts of capital to specific functions and specific groups of talented people for marketing, for auditing, for dev work, for strategies. So I think that's one approach. There's many other ones that sort of are interesting as well, but I think YFI is one of the projects that's furthest along in this design space.
Kinjal, anything you want to add on to what Matthew and Derek said?
Yeah, I think they both said agree. I mean, I really do think it's all about deciding what the goals are of the DAO, and then how do we best achieve that with the capital we have.
So what about, so each DAO has its own native token. Uniswap has the Uni token, Comp has the Comp token, and this token offers different optionalities towards DAOs, and it is part of the treasury, right? Usually DAOs kind of start off with their own token as the only part of the treasury, and then the token kind of mutates into something else. So Kinjal, I want to start with you. Is what is the appropriate way for a DAO to use its own token, and how does that answer differ depending on what the DAO is up to or what stage of maturity the DAO is in?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's many different functions of the token. Two of the ones that I think are most popular today is, you've got, of course, governance and voting, so using your token holdings to actually put a vote in. And then the second is growing your protocol, right? We saw liquidity mining kind of blow up last year, and one of the primary use cases for tokens was how do we incentivize protocol growth? I think what we saw was that liquidity mining was a great way to kind of do like a growth marketing hack. And now over time, it's really just becoming about how do we carefully design incentives with our tokens. So, users are wanting to hold them long term. Potentially they have to reach some sort of milestone to get more tokens, or, kind of showcase how they're committed and dedicated to building the DAO and not just, farming for a shorter period of time. So to right now, I really think it's all about growth, and then to a certain extent, getting paid in your token to go do some work for the protocol.
Matthew, we've seen the index co-op really go through a pretty fast pace of maturity, at least in my opinion. Has the role of the index token changed as the index co-op has also progressed and developed as a protocol?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Or also,
yeah,
how does the index co-op just leverage the index token as a valuable asset on its balance sheet?
Yeah, so the index token, like when it originally started, it was used as a tool to basically really push like DeFi Pulse Index, or DPI. So it became a governance token on the back of a product. So it was all about product growth and getting that product liquid. And it did that, and then it was used to like commercially push it that way. Through just liquidity mining, and then other incentives that happen thereafter. But then now, as the community's evolved, there's there's more and more voting that goes on. Like the community's more actively engaged. They're really trying to push index coup in a direction, which means a lot of proposals, voting. So it's very active that way. So the governance part of it's huge. And then through like the success of DPI, there's like the meta governance. So fortunate to have a product which holds basically other governance tokens, which then means index coup is now voting pretty significant portions of votes in some of the other like leading DeFi protocols, which is, it's just a huge value add to that governance token. You can essentially purchase one governance token and get access to another 14 or so.
Derek, how do you see the appropriate or perhaps inappropriate leveraging of a DAO's native token to help the DAO achieve its own goals?
I think it depends, heavily on the stage of a project. Has it found product market fit? How large is the community? How mature is it? But I think, like, generally speaking, like if you look at traditional strategies for companies and corporate balance sheets, it's like if they sort of need to raise operating capital, then it makes sense to diversify a little bit, sell some assets, move, like basically have your traditional diversified portfolio so that you can survive in any bear market. So I think that's just like a really obvious thing for projects to do when they're at the sort of appropriate maturity. But I think, like, more generally, project native tokens can be used to sort of work collaboratively with other protocols. Like, how do we get one protocol's tokens in the hands of the rabid community of another and get them to be on our side and aligned? And ways that can happen, it could be the sort of token like M&A approach, which we've seen some projects try. It could be the retroactive airdrops approach. It could be other stuff. It could be just liquidity mining. But I think there's like the most novel and interesting part of treasury management at this point is probably distribution, and getting and leveraging that to like have a robust and dedicated community. Because again, like, token holders can be parts of many different DAOs and projects, and treasury management is a tool and ultimately a weapon to get them to be involved and loyal long term.
And part of that incentive for involvement and loyalty at the end of the day, of course, and the purpose of DAOs at large is to really make the value of the DAO grow. And if the value of the DAO grows, it's theorized that the value of the token would also grow. Really, ultimately, a DAO is just trying to increase the value of the people that own the DAO's native token, you know, in theory, usually makes sense. And we've seen different DAOs try and approach different strategies to really get this done. Some DAOs, I think, aren't there yet, as in Uniswap has not really turned on any sort of fee capture mechanism to go into the treasury. They don't really need to because they have a massive treasury. But a DAO like Jung has done both YFI buybacks and purchases of ETH to put it on the balance sheet, which, again, in theory, goes to increasing the value of the DAO. So when it comes to actually capturing value to return it to DAO token holders, do you guys have any opinions as to the correct timing and also the correct mechanism for getting that done? And Kinjal, I would like to start with you.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of timing, I think this is probably like a trickier question, right? Because I think we're not completely sure when DAOs have reached maturity, or when, you know, even like they've achieved product market fit. I mean, you could argue some of the DeFi protocols already have that, of course, but I still think there's a little bit of a question there. The way I think about it, though, is probably a little similar to like vesting. So having those distributions come to users over a period of time where they've kind of vested their interest in ownership of a particular token. And then in terms of how it gets distributed back, we've seen this in a couple of cool ways where, you know, like Uniswap's retroactive airdrop, which was, you know, one of the coolest things I think last year. in the DeFi world. Everyone was just so excited, and I think it really felt like it hit their goal of going back and saying we want to kind of give our distributions back to all of our supporters from day one. So I think that's a really interesting mechanic. And then other ways are, airdrops I think will continue to be common, but also thinking about how different users will opt into different governance, either strategies or committees, and how you can potentially reward them. People are getting paid now by many, many different DAOs. And so that's one way also of incentivizing people to get larger distributions. Yeah, lots to come there.
Matthew, what about over at Index Co-op? Are you guys at the phase of development where you guys are focusing on token price go up or token number go up, or is it still kind of in the realm of DAO value go up, and we'll worry about the token price later?
I'd say Index Group's got like a very longer term kind of frame for thinking about these things. So very much about like, ensuring what products are out there do well, bringing more products to market, getting them well integrated and set up, really pushing the integrations and extrinsic use cases of those products. We're also really focusing on like building community ownership. So we want, now that we're 6 months or a long time past launch, we basically want to start building more community ownership, start getting a lot of the contributors really starting to think like owners. So very much just reinforcing that long-term trajectory. So that's where we're thinking in terms of like tokenomics. Like there's always discussions and ideas floating around. It's definitely a good talking point. And yeah, I think in time, I think a lot of these governance tokens will have some kind of tokenomics kind of upgrade as these DAOs, and basically their model they're working to kind of grows and expands what it can do. So yeah, it's exciting to watch.
Totally agree with what Matthew and Kinjal said. I guess the one caveat I would say and mention is that oftentimes token price is sort of a Schelling point for the community. And just like in traditional markets, if Amazon stock is doing really well or Apple stock is doing well, like they can raise debt sort of at better terms, attract more like sort of employees. I think the same still applies to crypto protocols. I wouldn't say it's the most, like price is not the most important thing long term, but it can definitely sort of create loops where you attract people because you have more resources. They contribute more sort of to the protocol and improve the fundamentals, and it sort of becomes a sort of a nice feedback mechanism. So I think I wouldn't anchor to token price if you're going to pick like one fundamental metric or indicator. Like I would pick like volume or origination volume or whatever. But I think it's also probably not accurate to say that it's like I think it's very important how price performs even when you just launch the token.
Yeah, and price is really it's its own marketing tool. We know this from Bitcoin. One of the biggest marketing tools that Bitcoin has is to break new all-time highs, so that so many different reporting agencies will report on Bitcoin once again, and all of a sudden there's a new influx of buyers. And also, you increase the value of your native token, you straight up have more value in your treasury, more capital to work with, more capital to leverage. I want to, Kinjal, you brought up the subject of liquidity mining or yield farming, and I want to kind of dive deeper into that, because at the end of the day, that's very much a intentional choice for a protocol to leverage as part of their balance sheet, and it really works really, really well when the token price is high, and doesn't work so well when token price is low. And I want to get you guys' opinions on the state of liquidity mining as a balance sheet strategy in 2021, because it's very different than what it was in DeFi summer when liquidity mining was brand new. Now liquidity mining has kind of become professionalized, gamified. Do you guys? I've started to see a decent number of protocols that have a token that have liquidity mining protocols or liquidity mining like offerings. And the token price, this is just my gut take, isn't really doing so well. And I'm worried about just the issuance of these things is really damping the price, which really costs the platform or the protocol the capital, because they are allowing people to farm their tokens who might not be incentivized to stay with the protocol and are just really just, are trying to be profit maximalists. Kinjal, do you share these concerns, or how do you see like liquidity mining as a strategy for optimized balance sheet management?
Yeah, I definitely share those concerns. I think that's kind of what one of our, at least the community's big learnings from last year is, people are just kind of going to farm the heck out of your protocol and then move on to the next one, right? Mm-hmm. And so like that's just human nature. Right. Let's find all the opportunity for yield and then
liquidity locus.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so I'm super excited about some of the experiments that people are, different projects are doing for long-term incentivization. So like UMA has a really cool product called KPI options, which is all about meeting particular KPIs. Like we want to hit. They did an experiment on themselves of, hitting 200 million in TVL, and then that would unlock a particular, it's an option. So that was kind of cool of just thinking through like how you can kind of incentivize a community. I think Rabbit Hole is doing some great work where it's like instead of speculation, you'll earn tokens by actually using the protocols and learning about them. So they have like launched these quests, and there are some other folks out there too. So to me, I think liquidity mining's like design space is much broader and more open. And now we're going to start to see a lot of cool shifts to like long-term incentivization for users and then also for devs to come join these protocols.
Matthew, I believe Index Co-op has a liquidity mining program in collaboration with SushiSwap. Can you talk about the decision-making and the behind that endeavor?
So liquidity mining in general for Index Co is basically a way of promoting a better user experience for the product. So by incentivizing liquidity, it just allows people to basically enter and exit their trades, or in our instance, purchase the product for a long-term hold, hopefully, which then helps feed back into our revenue stream. So we're looking at basically creating a really good user experience and getting the liquidity of the product in the market. So that's kind of how we're using token distribution to do that. I think what we've kind of seen is yield is very competitive. So, and if you go too high, it does get games. So you just got to be really smart with how you do it, and really analyze the knock-on effects. So, yeah, I think some of the other options that are coming up are, I think we're going to give better returns to treasuries rather than just straight shilling the token for liquidity.
Derek, do you have any thoughts on the whole concept of using a balance sheet for a native token with liquidity mining?
Yeah, I think at this point, and Kinjal touched on this, like, and you talked about this as well, like, it's probably not ideal for a project just to do vanilla large scale sort of liquidity mining based purely on sort of the amount of capital. Like liquidity mining is like contributing capital to these programs is the definition of a commodity. There's no sort of differentiation. So I think the industry is getting much more advanced and knowledgeable about how do we actually let people sort of show proof of work, that they're contributing something beyond capital, in addition to capital, and sort of show that they're sort of incentivized and be aligned long-term. Like you could imagine what if UNISWAP, instead of doing their large scale liquidity mining program back when they launched token in September, they were like only addresses that have sort of done a Uniswap trade or LP'd in the past can actually sort of earn rewards. And each address is limited to a certain amount of tokens. Like I think we're starting to see some projects try approaches like this, where it's like capping the total amount of capital that's available. So you ensure, because, and the reason to do this is like, you don't want to just compete with every other project on yields. That's like a zero-sum game. It's just throwing money away oftentimes. So it's like, how do we design a sort of not artificially high rate, but like sort of a mechanism that actually rewards have been involved already and will continue to be.
Derek, I want to stick with you as I turn the conversation to something a little different. Part of treasury management is straight up treasury management. And there's different ways to do this with regards to a DAO. DAOs are, token voting systems, but not all DAOs. Some DAOs are multi-sigs where just a few members worked at the behest of the rest of the organization. Also, to some degree, some DAOs will choose to allocate the decision-making of a particular treasury to a smaller set of individuals rather than have all of the DAO have a say in treasury management. So do you have opinions as to the correct treasury management practices and the internal organization for a DAO? And also, does that change with regards to where a DAO is in its state of development? Derek, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is, I think it depends. I don't think, every aspect of treasury management should be left up to on-chain vote. Just like that's not how decision-making is effective for anything. Like there are certain things like, okay, setting a budget or finding the right people to staff these committees, manage a budget, be the multi-sig members. I think those are all important to let everyone have a voice in. But I think, it's like the biggest problem isn't a lack of good ideas in sort of treasury management or governance, it's a lack of people actually doing it. So I think like the approach I'd love to see generally is rewarding and allowing for a bunch of small working groups, giving them all small budgets and sort of small power and letting them run with specific ideas. And you can design KPIs and metrics and see if something's working. Use that program, use that strategy, scale it up. But I think at this point, it's just incentivizing like people to actually contribute brain power and spend time, and then just seeing which experiments in treasury management work.
Kinjal, do you have any thoughts on how a DAO should approach its own internal treasury management?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo kind of what Derek said. I think like there's going to be some sort of delegation of decision making that's going to happen as these things scale. I mean, we're already seeing it right now, but hopefully that gets more codified when it becomes, like best practices of like, okay, we've now voted on who's going to be in the Treasury Management Committee, barring any decisions that are not related to X, they have full sort of responsibility. Because I think the way to move forward in the DAO and to move forward any sort of project is to give folks a little bit of, power, or maybe power is not the right word, but just like the ability to act on whatever decisions they're trying to make rather than having it all kind of come to a vote. So I would agree.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, how do you guys do it over at Index Co-op? I know I keep asking you about the details of Index Co-op, probably because I'm just innately curious, but how does Index Co-op approach its own treasury, and who gets to decide what happens with it?
Yeah, so probably some context around here is probably the size of the Index Group's treasury, which is, it's 30 to 40 million, so it's not as big as some of the other ones. So we use the working group structure, which works quite well. And essentially, it's a way of just putting like really specialized resources assigned to focus on a specific topic. And the way that kind of works for us is, you got regular community engagement the whole way through, and then you end up basically putting proposals forward, like governance forum for broader discussion, and then you basically vote as a community around it. So, and that's all kind of community elect, like who leads these groups, the main contributors to it. Obviously, the community supports what they do, and then ultimately there's enough engagement there so everyone can kind of buy into it, ask the questions, and form that consensus. So it still very much goes through the same governance process, at least initially. I think in time, the smaller sums of money, the more day-to-day stuff, that will probably get assigned to someone, because it's just noise to an extent. But then the big kind of structural decisions you're kind of making with like allocations and what you want to hold, budgeting, forecasting, stuff like that, I think that's all going to still go through very much a real broad review cycle to get everyone to buy into. So,
Matthew, do you see yourself and the rest of the working group being the thought leaders and just overall leaders of the Index Co-op DAO, or are you guys kind of acting as just acting upon the wishes of the DAO? Like who determines what the direction is? Is it you guys or is it the DAO?
So you can be a working group lead, but really it's just it's just a group of people working on a common task. And quite a lot of these people are all cross-pollinating across different groups, and they're not, tunnel vision on one particular topic. So I wouldn't think too much around it. Like, they might shape some of the decisions in the direction, but ultimately it's probably just refining some of the concepts and then take it to a broader audience is probably how I frame it, rather than say this is the direction everyone follow. I think the community goes where the community wants, and there's certainly a feedback loop in there too if the community is unhappy with a certain direction.
So really the working group that's responsible for treasury management is just perhaps like the branch of the index co-op that executes upon the wishes of the broader index co-op DAO, rather than actually formalizes and instantiates your guys' own opinion. You guys take input from the rest of the DAO and just executes upon the DAO's vision. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's like a recommendation that comes from the group, and then there's a review cycle that goes back through it. So I think is that you still got the whole governance process, you still got the whole community thing. It's just rather than having everyone trying to work out what to do, you're basically saying, you guys know, so you figure it out and then come back and tell everyone else what you think's best, and then we'll all have a chat about it.
So as we all know, in these crypto markets, they're extremely volatile. Things go really, really high. Things go really, really low. And I'm reminded of when in 2017, when Ether was trading above like $800, Vitalik encouraged the EF, the Ethereum Foundation, to sell a bunch of ETH to fund its own roadway, or its own runway. Now, the EF is not a DAO, but it kind of acts like a DAO, kind of feels like a DAO. And so my question is, in these volatile markets where, the volatility can break an entire company or an entire team, even though if they had just, had good treasury management, they would have been able to stick it out towards the end. How do you guys see the intersection of DAO treasury management and the volatility of crypto assets? Do you think it's appropriate for DAOs to be opportunistic when it comes time to sell into a good market? Or do you guys think that that's perhaps too much delving into the realm of trading and speculation? Derek, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea is like managing volatility is absolutely deeply intertwined with protocol treasury management. The tricky thing is, because the whole point of DAO treasury management is that it's an open, transparent process. And it's not like 2017 where teams could basically diversify and other community members wouldn't realize it. They could do it behind the scenes. Now it's transparent. So it's in some ways more challenging because most token holders don't want to see price go down ever. Not talking about the long term, just if you sell tokens, it can have a lockup, it can OTC, and increase the float, people might be against that. So I think it's absolutely something to manage and think about, and it's important to socialize these ideas and get people to understand that it's very important to think about these things if you want to maintain and retain talent long term.
Kinjal, do you have any thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I definitely think we saw a lot of pain after 2017 when projects did not manage their treasuries, or for whatever reason, right? There just wasn't a lot of diversification into some sort of stablecoin allocation. I think that would have helped a lot of projects kind of make it through the bear market. And the reality is that these are still very early markets, and so the volatility is likely going to persist for quite some time. Particularly when you think about early stage projects, right? If you were to go into an equity market and had just as liquid of a space for trading shares of a project that's only 6 months old, you would imagine it's going to behave very similarly, right? These are all super young projects. So I think it absolutely needs to be intertwined. I definitely agree that token holders are not necessarily going to love, they might have disagreements there, but I think it's just important to manage expectations. So, it's important, but potentially a little painful.
I think if you're just holding a pure governance token, you're going to feel the volatility of the market. So I think ultimately you've got an obligation to your community to ensure that you're going to be there and survive any kind of market downturn. So I think the first step for most of these DAOs is going to have some kind of balance of stable coins, even other low vol assets, and just kind of get something tucked away for that rainy day. And then from there, you can kind of go back to focusing on, making the most of the upside and the good times, and get back on the growth side of things. So I think as long as you've got the safety net, you can really go forward. I think over time, as your treasuries get bigger and you're more established, your risk profile changes, you can probably start exploring other options which kind of allow you to have exposure to the upside, and then probably have some kind of hedging to prevent some of that downside exposure. So you can kind of protect your wealth a bit for the community. So at the moment we are using just a multi-sig mainly, and that's because we're not really very active in doing any transactions. So I think at the moment we're just distributing into our working groups and then basically pursuing growth. We've got enough stables. We're still developing out our treasury management and how we're going to start deploying it. So yeah, we're still exploring what tools are out there and how we're going to do it for us.
Derek, anything to add about tooling when it comes to DAO Treasury Management?
Yeah, this might be a cop-out answer, but I think every DeFi project is a potential tool for DAO Treasury Management. I think that, like we saw Compound yesterday come out with, I think like sort of product 4% tailored towards companies, like that exact product or sort of thing is something that protocols will use, right? It might happen differently, it might look a little differently, it's going to happen more transparently on chain, but at the end of the day, it's just these DAO treasuries are pools of capital that need to do all of the things that the average DeFi user needs to do: trade, earn yield, hedge, borrow, lend, all of these things. So I think there's some differences between the average user or the average fund and DAO treasuries, but I think a lot of the leading projects today will be super important and are starting to be super important treasury tools. And there will be new companies built here as well, but I think it's deeply intertwined. DeFi TVL, I'm not sure what it is right now, but if you look at the DAO treasury sizes total, when and if it flows back on chain, it's going to have a huge effect. So.
Kinjal, anything to add with DAO treasury management tooling?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say DAO to DAO services is going to be the new B2B in some ways. We're just going to see a lot of folks that are trying to, go work with other DAOs. And then I think there's some element of how do we make treasury management more programmable and more easy to use when it comes to engaging with users. That's starting to be figured out now. So tools like Parcel or Multisafe are starting to work on this, where it's okay, if you want to do payroll, or if you want to engage with your users and do payments, or even coordinate, there's some really cool things happening there. Not exactly treasury management, but really thinking about distribution and how we kind of go from there. So lots to come.
Coordinate, I think, is fantastic infrastructure that really gets me optimistic for what DAOs could be. And if anyone wants to hear more about Coordinate, we actually did an interview with them on the Bankless YouTube, which viewers are watching at right now. Just wanted to do a quick plug there. Guys, thank you so much for helping illuminate the world of DAO treasury management. I think it's actually perhaps one of the biggest questions about DAOs, as these things are capital entities. How they manage their own capital is incredibly important. So guys, thank you for helping illuminate this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David.
Cheers. All right, guys, we are moving on, and the show does not stop. So coming up next, we have perspectives on decentralized governance with Jonathan Dotan. Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, David. Thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great. You ready to take it away, sir?
I am ready to go. So pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for making time to join this incredible event. Big shout out to Connor and team for putting this together. This has been incredible so far. I'm presenting some slides here which are going to cover some of the topics I was asked to get into around figuring out what are the precedents that we can use to help guide the next steps for decentralized governance. As a little bit about myself, I'm a fellow at the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research, and I'm also the director of the newly established Starling Lab, which is at Stanford and at USC, which is using decentralized ledger technology to advance human rights. In my capacity here, I'm going to talk about 2 years worth of research that I've done on decentralized governance, and specifically looking at the history of certain models in open source and also in cooperatives, and how they can help guide the future. So first of all, let's just give ourselves some context. Where are we at this moment in time? There's no question that we're at a moment of tremendous innovation with the corporate form. And if you look at what DAOs have done, they've unlocked discussions that have really been needing to happen for quite some time. And what we're trying to do collectively is to get out of the orbit of shareholder capitalism and a lot of the troubles that have existed with applying that model to internet native businesses. And by doing that, we hope to achieve this escape velocity to basically get out of that orbit. So the question then is, if I'm going to succeed today, is how can we maintain the enthusiasm and the rate of innovation, but at the same time face some sober realities about some of the promises that we're making, and make sure that we take adequate steps to fulfill those promises. So let's go ahead and begin and think about what some of those functions that DAOs are hoping to accomplish might look like. We've seen essentially, as everyone's talked about many times over, this progressive steps of decentralization that have really followed the unfolding set of functions that DAOs are now handling. So anything from protocol development and incentivization to now, like as we're seeing people wanting to push into DAOs the entire management and governance of a protocol in a more way. And then finally, as kind of a callback to 2015, we're now seeing DAOs focusing on how to pool resources and make investments. So kind of making good on the finally on the original promise of DAOs. So if we take these functions, we can split them elegantly into two types of precedents. One is that we can look at how open source technologies can help with certain things that are quite familiar, actually, that they've handled, the DAOs aren't getting into with development and incentivization. And then finally, we can look at the corporate form and how that can inform the types of things that DAOs are trying to do. And that's where cooperatives can be quite useful. So let's begin with open source. In many ways, if you go back to where open source began in the late 90s, now we have over 20 years of experience with open source communities. It's a miracle. What Netscape did is a Hail Mary to go and fight Microsoft for basically the future of the internet, succeeded beyond everyone's wildest dreams. It didn't just defend the model of engagement on the internet and saved it from centralized corporate control, which is ultimately what Microsoft wanted. But instead, it really unlocked a whole paradigm of development. And really, if you think about the economic impact of it, it is tremendous. And here are some stats from the EU to show really what the power is of open source. And I don't need to convince anyone here that this works, because basically all DAOs are premised on the idea that their code is open source so that it can be auditable and you can create these trustless systems. So if we look at the success of open source, one of the things that we can find is that actually there has been a tremendous amount of organization that has emerged over these 20 years for organizing open source communities. And if you go to Mozilla's website, I highly advocate for people to check out the open source archetypes document. This thing is really an incredible document that explains how open source communities work, what are their goals, how do they form, and the governance that's there. You can see here in the quick reference, like there's this awesome level of depth, and there's some really practical tools that people can use to say, okay, how could we base certain DAO functions and DAO activities on the wealth of management and governance practices that have evolved over the last 20 years with open source. But I want to focus on the realities, which is that, at least from an open source standpoint, because it's generally speaking a non-for-profit activity, and it's not automated yet in the way that DAOs are, these are entirely human-driven processes for the most part, and therefore they're vulnerable. If you look at things like the Heartbleed bug, I mean, it was a moment where it almost brought the internet to its knees, because so many people were dependent on open source software there, and you had to find somebody who was on a boat in the middle of the Netherlands in order to go and have them properly update the code. And now we're still dealing with zombie legacy issues from that bug. So it shows the vulnerability of human processes. We also have seen in the last 20 years that open source works in terms of development, but also the maintenance of open source communities. Generally speaking, the larger and more successful organizations still rely on major corporates to work and to fund their efforts. And that doesn't exactly feel right in terms of where DAOs want to head. And so, that reality is there. There's many reasons, but chief among them is that open source in its formation sought to embrace Fortune 500 companies. Finally, if you look at the results of what open source communities have developed in terms of code, there's been a tremendous successes, but then a lot of the problems that we're seeing with the Web 2.0 that I'm highlighting here, I mean, those specifically came out of advancements that came through open source development. So it's not to say that open source can't solve these things, but it is a reality that these things will not solve themselves. Decentralization and just making something open source doesn't inherently make it more resilient and can deal with these matters. And probably the most difficult thing here is that there's an assumption that's made, which is that with open source technology, open access, which anyone can have, doesn't necessarily yield inclusion. And the stats really bear this out when you look at who develops open source code. The challenge here is that open source, while incredible, is still very much based as an activity that is for predominantly males who are young to do their work. And when you think about that, as especially in the last year, as we've all started to look at systemic racism more seriously, it's clear that open source is a long way to go in order to manage a lot of these problems with inclusion. So what are some of those solutions? Well, surely, because we're all here for DAOs, we're excited about the new incentives that you can create with things like tokens that can potentially help get out of the nonprofit incentives that open source communities have developed and now into maybe for-profit activities and more formalized forms of governance. So it's in there that you need a better corporate form, and that's where we get to cooperatives. So let's talk a little bit about DAOs, where they sit. Initially, DAOs, if you follow the progressive decentralization model, they typically emerge from for-profit companies that then place activities into nonprofit foundations. And DAOs, in a way, are really something in between all of these things. They are for-purpose entities, which is exactly what cooperatives are. They share in their DNA, they're very much of the same value. And so when you think about, as we really want DAOs to consider their legal standing and potentially to formalize and to get out of that gray area where unregistered and unformalized DAOs are essentially going to be liable and classified as default partnerships. If you want to avoid all of that and get corporate benefits, then really cooperatives are a really good candidate for a corporate form. And so the key design features that I think are the most appealing for DAOs are this idea that the rewards in cooperatives are awarded based on this concept of patronage. The more you use a cooperative, the more you get to share in its success. And secondly, cooperatives don't aim to necessarily maximize a return on equity. They aim to maximize benefits or to maximize purpose. And that's because the owners of a cooperative are both the consumers as well as the shareholders. And there's a regenerative and a virtuous way to think about that type of ownership, because that means that you don't just want something to give a return on equity in let's say a dollar value or token value, but it means that if you're actually using the product, you want it to be awesome and you want it to continue to be awesome. Or if it's community, you want it to have values and to continue to espouse those values. So the good news with cooperatives is that they are actually quite a sturdy and hardened form of corporate entity. There's over 200 years of corporate history with cooperatives. A really good example when you look at, to really crystallize why they're so powerful, is how cooperatives were actually the dominant form of corporation back in the late 1700s. And you look at the numbers, and it's quite staggering that 1/5 of all US corporate charters in the United States in the late 1700s were actually with turnpikes, which are, I would say, the blockchains and tokens are really, if you think of them as infrastructure and essentially new infrastructure for a new economy, turnpikes were very much the same thing there. It was infrastructure for a young country. And so why I, as a business member, bought into a cooperative for a turnpike is because I wanted access to a road. And secondly, I want to make sure that my competitors couldn't force me out of it. So the real logic of cooperatives is that at their core, they have an incredible amount of success in dealing with antitrust matters. And I'll bury this here and come back to it later, the way that works is that you make sure that each member of the cooperative has a share, and by that, one vote. As opposed to the traditional model of corporations today, which, one member has one vote in a cooperative versus the traditional model in corporations today, where one share equals one vote. And that's a major distinction. Okay, where are cooperatives? They are everywhere in the economy. Sometimes they're noted as a cooperative, like REI, which many people might be a member of. In Europe and the UK and Japan, these are dominant forms of retail and healthcare and banking institutions. There's also many other examples. My favorite probably is that the New York Stock Exchange at its inception and for many decades was actually operated as a cooperative. So when you look at how could we use these for DAOs, I think that the first thing to acknowledge is that there are many challenges with traditional cooperatives. So if you look at your typical T Corp or LCA, there are a number of different restrictions that are quite onerous. Caps on dividends and limitations essentially on how you move shares around, they're not going to fly for DAOs. That's just a fact. And in particular, the way in which you do capital allocation, especially in light of what was just previously discussed with treasury diversification, a lot of the requirements there are liquidity requirements and are just not going to work. And the tax liabilities that come with some of these responsibilities are enormous. And so they're not necessarily the most tax efficient entity. So the more modern form of cooperatives, which most people should be looking at, is the Wyoming hybrid cooperative model, which was acted in 2001. And interestingly, what this allowed is for the commingling of members of a cooperative that were both holding common shares that were classified not as securities, and then third-party investment members that were holding preferred shares that are securities. And that's incredible, because that's actually what you want with a DAO to an extent, is you want to be able to delineate, you have a safe zone for people to operate with shares that are not securities. And then if you still want to do things like capital formation, you can do that as well with securities. The Wyoming DAO law, which a lot of people have talked about, which launches tomorrow, is certainly a very interesting step in the right direction. And when we think about all the innovations that are to come with the HR and collaboration mechanisms like joint ventures and even the autonomous proposals idea, those are incredible. And there's no question that they're going to be able to take flight with these new tools and corporate structures. But there's a little bit of a fallacy here, and I want to explain, which is that the Wyoming bill, while in theory it could work really well and could proliferate, the reality is that there's many things that could come in to create trouble with that if the members of the organization are not well thinking about these problems in advance. So as an example, not all DAOs are necessarily willing to embrace open source ideals. When we've taken that as a truth, but actually there's been some new proposals that have thought a little bit how we can create IP regimes. I'm not weighing in whether those are good or bad, but there's a reality, which is that cooperatives themselves or DAOs themselves really do need to think about their values. And secondly, the decentralization that comes with cooperatives doesn't always necessarily yield what we want. The AP is held up as an example of a cooperative, which is made up of thousands of newspapers and media organizations. And indeed, it's been an incredible asset in creating objective and reliable news for almost 2 centuries. But its current form as a cooperative while it's very appealing, and we might even think of like applying it to things like Twitter, which has been proposed, the reality is that that's come through a series of very challenging court cases in which actually it was found that the cooperative was violating various antitrust laws. And the AAP went rogue and actually started to play a cat and mouse game with different courts to continue to evade essentially accountability. So just to emphasize here that accountability is still really important because DAOs could yet run amok. So let me leave here very quickly with some lessons for DAOs. One, if it isn't been clear from the lessons from the open source community, we need to think about diversity and embedded values proactively. This should not be an afterthought. The history of co-ops has shown that they've been incredibly important for the civil rights movement, and it urged people to look at that history as a really good model of how we can embed values. Second, once we get the issues, past the issues of liability, taxation are really going to, those issues are going to be a major fulcrum for adoption. And look no further than the example of LLCs. Although LLC laws were passed in 1977, it wasn't until 1988 that the IRS actually ruled on how they would tax, and it was only after that that LLCs became such a dominant form of corporate form. So we need DAOs to figure out their tax model. And finally, I think it's worth looking at ways in which voting could potentially be to inherit some of the logic that comes from cooperatives with the one member and one vote strategy, because that ultimately will create self-fulfilling prophecies around inclusion. So with that, I will yield the floor back to the rest of the panelists. I hope these ideas have been helpful. And as I said, if I've been successful, everyone remains optimistic about the future of DAOs and hope that these tips and tools can help us evolve them to their next stage. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. That was fantastic. Coming up next, we have an all-star lineup on a great panel asking the question about how DAOs are better than C Corps or LLCs. The theme of the panel is DAO governance best practices, and we have the moderator, Larry Sukernik, to introduce the rest of the guests. Larry, ready to take it away?
Let's do it.
All right.
So as David mentioned, we have an awesome group of folks here to discuss DAO governance best practices. To start us off, I'll do a quick introduction on all of the panelists, and then we can dive right into the discussion. So we've got Amy, who was formerly with Maker and the Maker Foundation, Rafael from Tally, Julia from Orca, Scott from Gitcoin, and then Kevin from Boardroom. And for those of you who don't know me, I'll be moderating. So I'm not a panelist, but I'll be asking these guys some really cool questions. So I guess to start off with, guys, how do you think about how DAOs and DAO governance, how do you compare it to traditional companies, whether it's C Corps, LLCs, and on other similar entities?
I can definitely start. I mean, from my perspective, I think Jonathan actually just recently did a really good job of kind of talking about this new infrastructure angle of what DAOs are. And like, we kind of see corporations as, like, in my view, like I think a lot of people in the space see them as coordination tools first and foremost. And their coordination tools, like one thing I like to say is that like corporations, just like Latin corpus, like for body or body of people, it's just literally like groups of people working together towards a common goal. And I think, we've seen not a lot of innovation in that concept since corporations, at least in like the Western tradition, like have emerged. And like cooperatives are actually, like as Jonathan mentioned, one really interesting new-ish angle to that, although they've existed for a long time historically. In our conception, we don't see them very well often used. And part of that is because the infrastructure is just very challenging. It's very opaque. It's very complicated for anyone to use. So from my perspective, DAOs are tooling that not only make the coordination easier, but also just more flexible. Hopefully you can, in the future, we'll see more coordination that allows for these sorts of cooperatives and new structures that are sort of like related to, but maybe beyond corporations to emerge.
Yeah, I'd add on really quickly to that, firms for the most part exist to reduce transaction costs, external transaction costs, and establishing a trusted relationship between an external party and someone within the firm, right? So I think the biggest differentiation is honestly that, now with some of these governance structures where the process and rules are actually outlined, sometimes on chain, sometimes off chain, sometimes by social consensus, we can actually reach agreement and establish trust with a counterparty, without the necessity of like that formal contract that honestly, incurs a lot of cost for traditional more firm structures. So it is really just about more of a, if you look back to the theory of the firm, and simplify it to some extent, it is really just about reducing external transaction costs. I mean, that's why firm structures exist.
I think that's why there's sort of a lot of discussion around efficiency. And to me, that's like the biggest difference between DAOs and these legacy corporations. When legacy corporations, I kind of have a design and operations background. So I think about the structure and governance is like, for example, a structure of rules. But when I think of what's driving that structure with legacy corporations, it has a lot to do with this idea of competition. And a great example is like autonomous cars. You see all these different organizations creating their own version using like their own kind of secret, resources. And that's driving the innovation. And I think the difference with DAOs is that from right away, you have the success, like the reason a DAO it's built on is this maximizing of the collaboration. So you have these managed, you kind of have these like pooled resources that this group of people are trying to manage. So of course, you're just trying to maximize how that collaboration works best. And that can be DAO to DAO, that could be individual inside a DAO and kind of goes on. And to me, that's sort of the main reasons we need to like maintain that open network, what I call like the network effect of DAOs versus seeing that legacy corporation, which is super siloed because it's looking for that efficiency and drive.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, like I sort of wrote about this in the preamble, that I think that a lot of like legacy corporations have really dehumanized like human coordination, which is really the structure of what a corporation is. And I think that with DAOs and like what we're all building today, we're all sort of remembering that the most basic primitive within governance and these organizations is humans and human coordination. And I think we are like really revolutionizing the way that we can coordinate and effectively collaborate as people.
Yeah. Great points from everyone. I think I don't have that much to add. I think maybe I'll just add one frame I'm using to think about how DAOs are playing out and how they might continue to play out. And that's by kind of taking two analogies, right? The corporation analogy and also the internet analogy. And I think in some ways, a good place to start is that DAOs are internet native corporations. I think probably that analogy is mostly wrong. In 5 years, we'll look back on it and think it's mostly wrong. But right now, I think it's a good place to start. And what I think that means is we'll see kind of a barbell effect, just like the internet has made some really huge corporations and some really small ones. I think DAOs will probably be even more of that. There'll be really tiny DAOs of just a few people or even just fractions of a person's attention. And then some really huge DAOs, because they're not tied to a single legal system, they can be the whole internet or the whole world could be aligning on one organization, one project. I think we already start to see that if you think of huge layer one protocols like Ethereum or Bitcoin as DAOs themselves, then I think those are the really huge organizations. And then we also see some really small ones because they're really cheap to start and really easier than incorporating, where you have to file paperwork. You have to either lawyer or pay a company like Stripe to file the paperwork for you. DAOs can be much, much cheaper and almost free.
There's a lot of talk here about DAOs reducing and companies reducing coordination costs. And I think that's true. And at the same time, anyone who's really intimately familiar with some of the DAOs and kind of works for them as a contributor knows that they're super uncoordinated. And everyone is kind of running around, contributors are running around with without really any sort of coordination. Is this a growing pain? Do we need some sort of centralization? How does everyone sort of balance that view?
Yeah, I sort of always joke that DAOs today are either decentralized or organized, not both at the same time. So we have like these two ends of the spectrum. We have like the uber decentralized projects, but as a result, they can be really disorganized. And then we have the uber organized projects, and as a result, they're somewhat centralized. So I think that we're still like very early in finding some in between in that spectrum of how we can kind of like harden and create better organizational infrastructure to serve like the very disorganized but decentralized projects, while also creating better infrastructure for some of these more centralized projects to extend outwards.
Yeah, I think there's also no need to throw away 30 years of corporate governance out the door. You know, like sometimes some efforts require specialization and departmentalization. And honestly, you know, the Gov 2.0, I think, movement that we're also seeing right now with a lot of these DeFi blue chip projects, you know, speak to that. There has to be some delegation of responsibility. There has to be, you know, some specialization in these massive structures in order to, you know, achieve your goals. And I think what we're going to start seeing is, you know, very more specialized, almost sub-DAOs or small departments, guilds, you know, with very specific mandates that get an allocation from the bigger DAO structures or bigger networks, and that are highly specialized and focused, right, on achieving a specific goal. And I think you kind of need that. I mean, there's a reason why corporate governance and corporate hierarchies and structures have developed in that way. And sure, you know, we don't need to necessarily apply all of those lessons to what we're building here, because they are very different structures. But you know, we can learn a lot from the past 30 years. And I think it's sometimes easy to dismiss it.
I think one thing to note is I think we're doing a bit better than we think in some ways. Like we could definitely have more executive structure, but like a lot of these DAOs kind of went from like a few people working on a team to like now you have like 10,000 plus participants in some cases in some of these protocols that are like now trying to coordinate. It's pretty reasonable to expect that like they would have trouble doing that. And in hindsight, I do think Kevin has a really good point that like we should about other organizations structure themselves. But I would think back to like, you know, why we're sort of introducing those coordination costs in the first place. And like, you have this like obviously like history and governance of like monarchies and then like sort of like decentralized, like more decentralized democracy type systems emerging. And you sort of have the same history in like corporations where like this concept in Web2, like founder monarchies was like a big deal. And like that was like the sort of way things were going. And now we have this exit to community sort of model. And I think we'll probably reach, to your point, somewhere in between where like there are executive committees that can execute certain functions. But like, I do think one thing we should be cautious of is like taking, to your point, like the fact that there are these growing pains to mean that we should like totally re-centralize like the DAOs that we're looking to structure. Because I think it's very possible that we swing too far in the opposite direction. So not like a, you know, I don't have a good solution to that, but there's definitely some balance to be thought about.
I think a lot of
sorry. Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry, I know that just on this topic, I think the way that we kind of create a decentralized network that's somewhat more organized and maybe delegated is through more of these like peer-to-peer checks and balances. So I think of the word like redundancy, and a lot of people are, when you think of that back to that legacy corporation where redundancy means you're wasting resources, in kind of open source, I think that's not the case, because what you're creating through that redundancy is actually resilience. So when you even look at, for example, at Maker, there's these core units, and these core units are the wrapper of like a mandate, a team lead, and then like the budget itself. And anyone could actually propose that core unit. You can have duplicates of that core unit, and it's actually welcome to have duplicates of that core unit so that we can compare what's working, or maybe this team is experimenting with something better. And I think we have to sort of let go of that legacy thought of like, we're wasting everything, we need to be most efficient, because in the end, if we're going for the value of that resilience and kind of I think Robert from Compound had talked about earlier, it's like, it doesn't go down because there's so many decentralized nodes in many ways of that happening. That's how we can also think about organizations. It's just not normal or natural to us because we're so used to that efficiency model.
Raf, I'd like to go back to something you said earlier, which is, it's okay for us to call DAOs internet native companies, but 20, 30 years from now, we'll probably have a different mental model or maybe framework for defining it. I'd love to kind of double click on that and kind of hear how you think we will think about, DAOs 20, 30 years from now, and then how everyone else here thinks the community will think of the future as well.
Yeah, I think one thing I noticed, especially in this question we were talking about, decentralization, I think right now we're focused a lot on means, like what's the best way to do this. I think in the future, the means will be less novel questions and will be focused much more on ends. So right now we have a ton of stuff to figure out, both in like the code part of the technology, but maybe even more importantly, the social part of it, the social technology, the social norms. And I think right now what I'm seeing in DAO land is just tons and tons of parallel experiments. There's so many people in the space with cool ideas, and they're not together in small or medium or large communities. And we're going to see which things start to work. And people are gonna, just like an open source software forking code, people are gonna fork the social norms and the social technologies too. Those are gonna spread. And then long term, I think people will start to figure out and reuse the things that work. And I think we'll be less focused on, is this organization decentralized and autonomous, and more focused, people will kind of agree, like everyone will think, oh yeah, of course it's decentralized and autonomous, and they'll have more questions and more focused on what are we doing and how do we get there.
Rafa, just to add really quickly to that, I think we've seen like a little spark of that already, right? Like the fact that everyone just convened around the norm of using discourse in a snapshot space or a compound Bravo fork, right? And like a Discord server to spin up a DAO is pretty insane, actually, if you think about it, with this, the speed that's evolved and like has become a norm. So I think as Ralph said, like as we develop these, like as we evolve these norms and like figure out how to best coordinate, we'll be able to do the same at incredible speeds, which is exciting.
So one interesting thing that I want to touch on is that like corporations as a notion, even in like startups, are kind of like being diluted. Like no one really wants to be a corporation. Even in like 20 years ago, no one really wanted to be a corporation, like the early web boom. And I think part of the reason for that is, it's just like known or like thought to be this bulky thing, and like doesn't really have a lot of flexibility. And like a lot of people now start to talk about this idea of like starting a business or sharing money as being as easy as starting a group chat, for example. And I think maybe that's one of the like mechanisms or one of the sort of like frameworks we'll start using a lot more frequently, is like, what does it just look like to have like to Kevin's point, like a discourse or like a Discord server? Or it's unfortunate that those like we use like, but like having tools that represent just sharing value with friends, like creating like value together, creating culture together, like that sort of stuff to me seems much more natural. And maybe some of those things will mirror what we already understand corporations to do in some contexts, but like I think it's more of almost as much as it's like a mechanism, sort of like structural shift, it's a sort of cultural or value shift as well.
Amy, I think something you would have a really interesting vantage point on, given your prior work at Maker, is kind of chatting about that switch from going from a foundation organizational structure to more of these kind of core units. And it seems like Maker was one of the first large DAOs to do this, and other DAOs are thinking about spinning up these either pods or subcommittees or sub DAOs for themselves as well. Can you kind of talk about the motivation for that and how you think it's worked out so far?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of teams have asked me very similar questions, and there's no cookie cutter solution, right? There's sort of the solution that works for your DAO, and that kind of designing what that framework might look like was, for example, at Maker, there's a lot of people who have families and don't want to like work at a random DAO, and they want to, be able to have a 401k or whatever they need as at the same time, we have someone like super globally, Maker has, even the foundation has always been global and remote first. So we started with just like asking ourselves, like, what are the constraints and who are we designing for? And what kind of responsibilities do people have? And what's going to be the new responsibility in this new paradigm for them? And how, like, what supporting resources is that going to be? So a lot of it was just like searching for resources. For example, we work with, we introduced this like one team, Accountable, that is sort of this employer organization. And so if you yourself, you want to be employed by, you want to get fiat, no problem, then you can actually like sign up through this employer organization, and then they would receive DAI, for example. The protocol funds would go straight to them. So thinking about how we can collect some of these resources, share it with people and say, okay, how do you mix and match that structure? And so the flat framework is super adaptable. Like I said, it's only 3 things. It's like, what's your responsibility? What is the budget you're asking for? And who is the person responsible? But then if you want to get more focused, we have one team that was governance, and governance is like led by an anonymous person, and they're not going to go ahead and start an entity, right? So then they're like, we're fine with keeping this like decentralized, but we're going to be super transparent about how things are salary set. Then we have teams that are more wanting to be entities, and then they might be more structured and want to take on more of this like accountable kind of team, the company where people are getting fiat. So that flexibility allowed us to just see like what people take and how people mix and match, and then start to kind of, I think the convergence right now, what's happening is what's working, what are the kind of like points that are not working. Like we just had a discussion around MKR compensation, and that's always like a really hot topic, right? But in the end, it was like the community kind of came over, people threw their own ideas about it, and then kind of collectively are voting on whatever proposal works. So that being said, like I don't think Maker, I think everyone thinks like we solved it and everyone's fine, but it's just like new challenges, right? You're constantly leveling up, like, okay, we figured out this thing, what's next? And so on. So it's kind of incremental.
And Scott, maybe a question that could be fun for the listener is Gitcoin just went from being kind of a centralized company, right, a startup, to a DAO, right, recently. And I'm very curious, how has your day-to-day changed, pre-DAO and then sort of post-DAO? How are you doing things differently now?
It's a really good question. Like we kind of started with, this idea of stewards. And one of the really useful parts of how we set up when we did it, we weren't sure how well it would go, but what we did is required people to delegate when they started basically their token claim experience. And through doing that, we now have a list of about probably 50 really active stewards who are like kind of helping steer governance in the right direction. They've kind of, it's kind of just organically, I think we've been very lucky that like it's kind of organically emerged in ways that we didn't necessarily expect. There was this whole original decision around the HITA tokens that Vitalik gave us, and that was the whole thing, which led to a very interesting like sort of tutorial island for the DAO. But that process kind of helped us really solidify like what is the governance process, and we're actually like sort of getting close to ratifying those rules now. After kind of just putting forward a rough initial draft, and it helped us ratify what the work stream should be, what kind of things the DAO should be focused on to start. And I think we have a lot of room to grow. Like I wouldn't say we're there yet. Like there's a lot of growing pains. For context, Gitcoin has, I think, probably in the range of 100,000 people that are like, on whatever the email list is, and maybe probably closer to like 20,000 of those are like active in the platform. So it's a large community overall to coordinate. But having this group of about 50 or so people that are really actively stewards, I think has been really just like extremely valuable. And so, that's maybe one suggestion I would give to people who are starting this sort of like process of decentralizing a larger protocol. In terms of the day-to-day though, we still maintain some of the like core team. That core team works on some things that we can't decentralize quite yet. But things like Gitcoin grants were ratified by the stewards. They're sort of putting forward ideas around like how, for example, people who are building on top of Gitcoin grants get compensated. But we'll see what happens in the coming months. Actually, like I would encourage, like this is my like shill, but like gov.gitcoin.co is the governance forum. There's like a lot of proposals there that you can take a look at. But I think otherwise, I don't want to censure anything else proposal-wise because it might bias the stewards in one direction or another.
And Julia, a question for you. Orca is obviously building tools that help people working for DAOs more easily coordinate and manage resources. And so you're not a DAO yourself, but you work with a lot of DAOs to provide services and products to them and building these products. And I'm kind of curious, what, based on your experience working and kind of chatting with all of these disparate DAOs, what are some of the biggest problems you see communities have in kind of operationalizing and scaling the project?
Yeah, I think that Amy and Scott actually identified a lot of that. One being like what Scott just mentioned, of that you have these massive ecosystems of actors and basically expecting them to follow this North Star without any rails for coordination or guidance is a pretty impossible task. So what Scott just identified in introducing a steward system where you have sort of these delegated powers to these people that are responsible for creating some of those rails. And same with what Amy outlined in core units is that you have these smaller working groups that are tasked with very specific roles and responsibilities within an organization. And I think that's a very needed step for DAO contributors. When they show up to do work for a DAO, it's okay, where am I supposed to be looking right now? There's so much happening in the space. And I think that, I mentioned this earlier, there is just a need for more basic organizational infrastructure and helping codify or codify specific roles and responsibilities within an organization. And I also think what Amy mentioned too, a big problem for DAO contributors is just incentive alignment and compensation mechanisms. I think that we haven't quite figured out the right mechanisms on how to properly capture and quantify contributions, which I think Gitcoin is working on, and it's an amazing thing. But for some of these looser ecosystems that aren't structured in that way, it's really hard to figure out what and how to value someone's compensation, which is one of the pain points that Amy identified that they're struggling with in their core units. And I think we've seen some tools like Coordinate, which is trying to attempt this compensation problem, but I think that the tools around that will tremendously evolve in the next year or so.
And all of you guys are, I imagine, members of one DAO or multiple DAOs and kind of active members of the community. And I'm curious, is there any sort of commonality between the really active DAOs that have really active contributors and the vibes are good? Is there any sort of common denominator across them that you've seen that you could say, hey, this is a necessary ingredient in creating an active community of participants?
One thing I mentioned is actually, the creation of a manifesto of a North Star. Why does this DAO exist in the first place? And I think, the most active DAOs that I've seen launch usually launch with that, as the center piece of the entire strategy, right? So, I mean, one I want to point out specifically, it's also the Bankless DAO. I remember when they launched, it was very, very centered around why they existed, right? And they were hey, we don't know how this is going to evolve. We don't know what structure this is going to take and how the contributions are going to evolve. But as long as we know why we're here and what we're actually working towards, we can build up towards that, right? And I think it's the same with any online community, right? And a lot of different corporations as well. I think it's really important that at the very least, especially for newer members that join afterwards, after the initial creation, they do have that, North Star, and that they really know why they're there in the first place.
One thing I'll quickly add is it almost, I think one analogy which a lot of people use, which I like because I grew up in that world, is a lot of MMORPG raids or guilds, right? You have these sorts of organizations that go off on these missions together and very clear guidelines about what each role is doing and what they're trying to do. And that kind of goes back to Julie's point about structure as well. But I think that core mission is the interesting part. But the other aspect of those organizations that's I think really relevant is just like kind of, gamification as a term I think is like kind of overused. I don't want to like, but there's like something like that. It's maybe some better term that someone else would come up with that I can't think of right now, that like would kind of encapsulate that idea of trying to get people to really feel like they're sharing this like almost kind of just like magical experience together. And like that experience kind of is like the core of what they're doing. Like that's like the actual activity. And then the activity is of course facilitating like completing this broader mission. So just, I would actually like maybe just encourage people to think about that framework and think about like, the RuneScapes, like the like WoWs is like examples of some of these frameworks for DAOs down the road.
I think even I would say for us, like and what I've seen in different DAOs as well is like a working group. It's something I think, as Julia said, you kind of come into a DAO and it's super intimidating. There's a lot going on. You're not really sure how to do it. But when you see smaller cohorts come together, in the case of Gitcoin, there's work streams, they have different names for it, guilds, etc. It drives this like smaller community within your community that then people feel like, oh, there's a cadence for like coming to a meeting, or there's a cadence or a purpose that is a smaller bite of like how to tackle this in a greater picture. So just as super simple, like a working group, like multiple working groups, and then making sure they're communicating, like what do they do? How do they do it? What's going on? I would say that I've seen across like even Index Coop and so on.
Kevin, on your point about the importance of this manifesto, or this kind of like a social contract that people all buy into, I think in my experience, people and DAO contributors are generally in favor of that. But one thing people are unsure about is who actually writes it. Is it a top-down sort of thing? Do you have a community kind of write it together and sort of have a design by committee to buy into that social contract? How do you see that document actually coming into life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think DAOs at the end of the day, and all of these governance processes, they're just tools, right? I mean, they're tools that coordinate like social, like human relationships, right? So at the end of the day, it's like just humans coordinating to achieve a certain goal and leveraging these set of rules, these processes to actually do so in the first place. So when it comes to the actual creation of like what we actually want to achieve as a DAO, it doesn't differ too much from like why we create a subreddit, right? Or like why we create any digital community. It's honestly, just human relationships, humans coming together to establish like this goal that they have in mind, right? It could be based out of curiosity or need, or honestly, we want to improve the world or whatever it is. And we should see DAOs as just like an additional tool, an additional process that helps us get there. But honestly, I think in terms of stakeholder mapping, like who actually creates this manifesto in the first place, I honestly see that anyone can create it. Pretty much, like as long as you can coordinate a community and establish some sort of global like interest from anywhere in the world in your core mission. Pretty much, there's absolutely no reason why anyone, any type of stakeholder should be able to create a manifesto for a specific use case. Demand and supply are pretty much going to demand like determine the interest in that specific goal, and by proxy the size of your DAO and the actual the scale and growth of it as well.
I know we're running a little bit low on time, so last few questions, but I've spoken in private with some of you about just the term DAO, right? And a lot of you hate the term, right? And the community seems to hate it too. What do you think? Is this the term we'll end up with, or 20, 30 years from now, we'll come up with a new term that's actually sticky?
We're going to go back to decentralized autonomous companies in the 2014 Ethereum Foundation post. We're just going to like jump all the way back to that original conception. But no, I really don't have a good answer here. Raf, go ahead. Saw you going off.
Yeah, I think these things are really hard to change. Even if a lot of people don't like it, or if people want to change it, it's really hard to coordinate a lot of people, as we know. And I think we've seen it. I've seen this a few times when some idea gets tagged with a name. Like I remember when DeFi was tagged with a name a couple of years ago, there were a few other attempts like, oh, we should call it Open Finance instead, or I think there were a few other names. And I think the problem is once the name gets away from us, it's sort of too late. So maybe there's also some latent virality, like maybe the name is better than people think. Like everyone who is okay with the name is not complaining about it. They're just building.
Not to jump in too much again, but like I would just note, everyone also originally was like NFTs is a dumb term. Like no one liked the term NFTs. Like I think a lot of people still don't, but like it stuck. And like I think half the people who like use the term NFT don't really have any conception of like what it stands for. But it doesn't really matter once it is assigned, like to Raf's point, once it has that value assigned to it.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like sort of taking on like a meaning of its own, I feel like already. And we're already seeing like the definition of what a DAO is stretched so much. So I feel like it's less about like what we call it, but more of like what that thing actually is, like the definition and like the characteristics of what a DAO are or is.
Yes, it's Julie mentioned. I think the sorry, go. I think the reason why we hate it so much is because we're like nitpicking, right? Like, is this community autonomous? Is this like, you know, how much is this decentralized, right? At the end of the day, I think if it helps spread the narrative easily, right, the same way that we've seen with DeFi and NFTs, we should honestly push for it, even though we're being nitpicky as builders in this space, right?
Totally agree. And then the final question for each of you, but if you could, you know, you have a magic wand, you could wave it and solve any problem in the DAO space, but it has to be in the DAO space. What would that one problem be that you could automatically remove?
I can go. In information flow. So I've been thinking a lot about how information flows within networks. And in a DAO particularly, or anything of scale, you have a problem of like too much information, too little information, not the right information, etc. I think there's an infrastructure somewhere or a multitude of frameworks that can improve this. I just don't know what yet, because I think we're still stuck in like, how do we, you know, like do this in with tools that we have today? So I think if we did that, the way information flows would be super interesting to see, to kind of like lift how we would grow.
Yeah, if I could pick one thing, I would pick what Amy said, information flows. But if I was picking a second thing with my wand over, I would say it's legal uncertainty. I think there are a lot of the, especially US-based, especially finance-focused DAOs that want to like make some changes to the way the organization works, but don't feel comfortable doing it. Like it seems like it would be better technologically, socially, incentive-wise, but they don't feel comfortable doing it because they're not sure what the legal regime is. And so if there were just answers to those questions, then I think they would be able to experiment a lot more with how they structure their organizations.
I can go. I think like, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, just I mean, I think I would push for just you know, the social layer to be developed a bit more, so we can actually categorize different stakeholders and map them properly to the DAO types. I think if I were to wave something tomorrow, we'd essentially move up 5 years, right, and have the social tools on top of DAOs already have evolved to a point where we can actually you know, build like DAO to DAO interactions and proper stakeholder mapping. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
One thing that comes to mind for me is just like, how do we ensure like sort of accountability across like we have a stewards program, like stewards are going to be like a really important component. And so far it's been good because people have sort of like just actively jumped in on parts, but like, how do you ensure like long-term accountability for people that like start to hold positions of power within these structures? Like we talked a lot about like protocol politicians across like different ecosystems. Like, how do we make sure that, you know, we can sort of like track and manage those protocol politicians and like kind of keep them not in check, like, but like make sure that like they're acting according to the will of like their delegates in this sort of democratic system.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, Scott. But I think that another big part is sort of what I mentioned earlier, is just like how we value contributions. And I think Jonathan kind of touched on this in his presentation of like, when we think about who's actually participating, if 96% men, and then like how people are, you know, being valued and compensated. I think that's like a massive problem that needs to be solved and will really help with like the accessibility problem in the space.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for this panel. I want to thank all of you for being on it. Awesome answers and really great discussion. And I will now hand it off to the organizers for the final presentation at the end.
Thanks all. Thanks, Larry. So final word, I just want to take a second to thank everyone for joining today, of course, and I'd love to thank too all of our panelists and those who helped organize. I'm going to list a couple names, in particular, Jonathan Dotan, who's appearing with me here, Connor McNamee, Josh Stark, Sina Habibian, Larry Sukernik, David Hoffman, Dan Boneh, and Shreyas Haran, and many others. Big thank you too to the organizations that made this possible. So the Ethereum Foundation, ETH Global, the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research, Statler Labs, the Starling Labs, and the Bankless DAO. So we started the summit, as we mentioned before, to encourage folks in the DAO community to collaborate and to help identify the biggest issues in the space and think through how do we resolve those issues as a community. You know, as I said earlier, we want to operate to really start operating and open sourcing the information that DAO stakeholders, so you folks who are listening, are learning. And we want to provide to the group more broadly where we can. One way to do this is, of course, by sparking conversations at events like these. So please reach out to panelists who you find particularly interesting. I'm sure they would love to hear from you and be open to collaborating with you. I mean, we're at a stage in innovation in DAOs where people are generally speaking open to that sort of collaboration. So let's take advantage of it. Another way, of course, to participate is potentially through the DAO Research Cooperative, which, as I mentioned, is an organization that is funded by currently Compound, Uniswap, and AAVE, and we're leveraging pooled resources from DAOs to help open source some of that information that's going to be critical for DAO operation. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan Dotan for the final word.
Thanks, Connor, and thanks to everyone that has been mentioned before. This has been an incredible conference, and surely just by looking at the comments on YouTube Live, it's clear this has stirred some important discussions. I know everyone wants to get off, so I'm going to be very quick with just a couple of really quick pieces to sum up what I think has emerged. The first is, if it hasn't been clear, we're moving away definitively with DAOs from an idea of zero-sum competition to positive sum cooperation. And that in and of itself is just such a powerful thing. And now we're seeing the emergence of that interaction into something with a DAO as a real alternative to the traditional corporate form. Today, you've seen a number of different people speak from companies that provide real world examples of how this can work. They're providing real technical tools and legal tools, and contributing to those is going to be the way forward for how we're all going to be able to evolve DAOs. And then also what's been discussed is interesting is some iconic milestones like the Legal Education Fund, where there's no question that that's going to make a change in how people come to understand both the policy and with broader adoption of DAOs, how to treat them, and in fact, how to legitimize them in the current economy. That will involve likely the acceleration of forking. And I think one of the most fascinating things I heard today was panelists talked about forking not only technical code, but also forking social innovation. I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, that just like evolution works, you want rapid change and evolution in order to get stronger and more resilient systems. That will include things like the delegation of powers and things like autonomous proposals. Those are fantastic opportunities to make DAOs more effective and more efficient. To start to create differentiated roles means that we're going to end up having a lot more interactions and adoption. At the same time, it is also a surface for abuse and a surface for friction. And I think specifically in the legal space, we're going to see things emerge that are not just examples of fraud or hacks, but there will be defining lawsuits that take on governance and employer relations that are established through DAOs. And I would just put out there that essentially that's a sign of progress. that you want to be able to stress test the system and then understand exactly what the right way is for this type to emerge. Because ultimately, this is a young space for innovation. There's a very real possibility that the next summit that we have on this topic won't even be called the DAO Summit, as Larry has mentioned. Maybe it's called something else. And there's no question that there's going to be new solutions, potentially ones from the people in this very audience, that will emerge as the most innovative and the most dominant. It is just indeed that fast moving of a space. So I'll leave you with one final thought here, which I think is really important. If Web 3.0 is a response to the problems of Web 2.0 and the oligopoly of major players and platforms in the Web 2.0 space, let me urge everyone to not make the same mistake that we made in Web 2.0, which is that as we see financial benefits accruing, innovation happening technically and even socially, remember that the #1 problem with Web 2.0 was blind trust. Blind trust that somehow if we trusted these companies that they would sort out the whole thing, that they essentially own the future. And if decentralization means one thing, it's that it means you have to take responsibility to become a stakeholder and to do your part to contribute to these systems. And that means you, everyone here in this audience. So look forward to seeing what you all create, being a part of that revolution as it emerges. Thanks again to Connor, and best of luck with launching this legal cooperative. This is, in a sense, one of the maiden voyage here with it, and we're all hoping for many more exciting activities from it to come.
Hey, we hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, head over to Bankless HQ right now to develop your crypto investing skills and learn how to free yourself from banks and gain your financial independence. We recommend joining our daily newsletter, podcast, and community as a Bankless Premium subscriber to get the most out of your Bankless experience. You'll get access to our market analysis, our alpha leaks, and exclusive content, and even the Bankless token for airdrops, raffles, and unlocks. If you're interested in crypto, the Bankless community is where you want to be. Click the link in the description to become a Bankless Premium subscriber today. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for in-depth interviews with industry leaders, Ask Me Anythings, and weekly roll-ups where we summarize the week in crypto and other fantastic content. Thanks everyone for watching and being on the journey as we build out the Bankless nation.